Hospitals let a soft-spoken nurse drift from ward to ward. He may have killed 400 patients before anyone noticed. The cardiac monitor's steady beep became a flatline at 3:47 a.m. on December 12, 2003, at Somerset Medical Center in Somerville, New Jersey. Mrs. Jin Kyung-han, a 68-year-old patient recovering from a relatively routine procedure, had been expected to go home that morning. Instead, she became the final confirmed victim of America's most prolific serial killer, a soft-spoken, seemingly compassionate nurse named Charles Edmund Cullen, who had spent 16 years methodically murdering patients across 9 hospitals in 2 states. What made Cullen's case particularly chilling wasn't just the staggering scope of his crimes. Authorities estimate he killed between 35 and 400 patients, making him potentially the most lethal serial killer in American history. It was the institutional failures, the willful blindness of hospital administrators, and the ease with which a predator could move through the healthcare system, leaving a trail of unexplained deaths that were dismissed as unfortunate but inevitable in the world of critical care medicine. The man who would become known as the Angel of Death was born on February 22, 1960, in West Orange, New Jersey, into a family that would be marked by tragedy from the beginning. Charles was the youngest of 8 children born to Florence and Edmund Cullen. His father, a bus driver, died when Charles was just 7 months old, leaving Florence to raise the children alone. The death of his father was the first in a series of losses that would define Charles's childhood and, according to forensic psychologists who would later study his case, potentially shape his twisted relationship with death and suffering. Growing up in a cramped apartment in West Orange, Charles was described by neighbours and family members as a quiet, withdrawn child who seemed to carry the weight of the world on his small shoulders. His mother struggled with depression and alcoholism, often leaving the older children to care for the younger ones. Charles, being the youngest, was frequently left to fend for himself. Teachers at his elementary school noted that he was an intelligent child, but seemed perpetually sad, often staring out windows during class as if his mind was elsewhere. The Cullen household was marked by instability and emotional neglect. Florence Cullen's drinking became more severe as Charles entered his teenage years, and she would often disappear for days at a time, leaving the children to wonder if she would return. When Charles was 9 years old, his beloved sister died in a car accident. When he was 14, another sister died from a drug overdose. These losses, compounded by his mother's alcoholism and emotional unavailability, created a perfect storm of abandonment and trauma that would later manifest in his adult relationships and his pathological need to control life and death. At West Orange High School, Charles was remembered as a loner who kept to himself. He was not particularly athletic or socially inclined, but he maintained decent grades and seemed to have found solace in books and academic pursuits. His guidance counsellor, Mrs. Patricia Connors, would later recall that Charles had expressed interest in helping people, particularly in the medical field. He talked about becoming a doctor or a nurse, she remembered in a 2004 interview with investigators. He said he wanted to help people who were suffering. This desire to help others, which would later become tragically perverted, led Charles to enroll in the Mountainside Hospital School of Nursing in Montclair, New Jersey, after graduating from high school in 1978. He was 21 when he entered nursing school, older than most of his classmates, having spent 3 years after high school working various jobs and trying to figure out his direction in life. At nursing school, Charles was described as a dedicated student who excelled in his clinical work. He seemed to have a natural aptitude for patient care and was particularly drawn to critical care units, where patients were most vulnerable and dependent on medical staff for survival. His instructors noted that he had excellent technical skills and seemed genuinely compassionate toward patients. However, some classmates found him odd and overly intense. He would talk about death a lot, recalled former classmate Susan Martinez in a 2004 interview. Not in a morbid way exactly, But he seemed really fascinated by the process of dying. He would ask a lot of questions about what happens when people die, what it feels like, that sort of thing. Charles graduated from nursing school in 1987 and immediately began working at St. Barnabas Medical Center in Livingston, New Jersey, in the burn unit. The choice of specialty was telling. Burn patients often endure excruciating pain and have high mortality rates, making it a unit where death was common and where unusual patient deaths might not raise immediate suspicion. It was at St. Barnabas that Charles likely committed his first murders, though the exact timeline remains unclear due to the hospital's poor record-keeping and the reluctance of administrators to cooperate fully with investigators. What is known is that during his time at St. Barnabas, several patients died unexpectedly, and Charles was present for an unusually high number of these deaths. However, in the world of critical care nursing, being present for patient deaths was not necessarily suspicious. Experienced nurses often worked the most challenging shifts and were naturally present during medical emergencies. The first officially confirmed killing occurred on June 11, 1988, when Charles was working at St. Barnabas. Judge John W. Yengo Sr., a 75-year-old respected jurist, was recovering from a heart attack when he suddenly went into cardiac arrest and died. The death was initially attributed to complications from his heart condition, but investigators would later discover that Charles had accessed the medication room at an unusual time and had withdrawn insulin, which he used to induce fatal hypoglycemia in the judge. The method Charles chose for most of his killings, insulin overdose, was particularly insidious. Insulin, when administered to non-diabetic patients in large quantities, causes blood sugar to plummet to fatal levels. The symptoms mimic those of many other medical conditions, making it difficult to detect without specific testing that was rarely performed in the 1980s and 1990s. Moreover, insulin breaks down quickly in the body after death, making post-mortem detection extremely challenging. Charles's personal life during this period was equally troubled. In 1987, he married Adrienne Taub, a computer programmer he had met through a dating service. The marriage was troubled from the beginning. Adrienne would later describe Charles as moody, withdrawn, and prone to sudden, inexplicable rages. She told investigators that Charles would disappear for hours without explanation and seemed to have no close friends or family relationships. Most disturbing, she revealed that Charles had attempted suicide multiple times during their marriage, including instances where he had ingested toxic substances and deliberately crashed his car. The couple had 2 daughters, Shauna and Erin, but Charles's relationship with his children was distant and strained. Adrienne filed for divorce in 1993, citing Charles's erratic behavior and her growing fear of him. During the divorce proceedings, she obtained a restraining order against Charles after he stalked her and made threatening phone calls. Court documents from the divorce reveal a pattern of controlling and obsessive behavior that would become characteristic of Charles's relationships with both his victims and his colleagues. Following his divorce, Charles's behavior became increasingly erratic. He attempted suicide several times, including a dramatic incident in March 1993 when he was found in his car in a parking lot with multiple stab wounds to his chest. He claimed the wounds were self-inflicted, but some investigators later wondered if this was a practice run for methods he might use on his victims. He was hospitalized for psychiatric evaluation, but was released after a brief stay and deemed fit to continue working as a nurse. The ease with which Charles was able to return to work after multiple suicide attempts and psychiatric interventions highlights one of the most disturbing aspects of his case: the failure of the healthcare system to properly screen and monitor its own employees. Despite clear signs of mental instability and a pattern of self-destructive behavior, hospitals continued to hire Charles, often without conducting thorough background checks or verifying his employment history. In 1992, Charles left St. Barnabas and began working at Warren Hospital in Phillipsburg, New Jersey. During his time at Warren, several patients died under suspicious circumstances, including Helen Dean, an 82-year-old woman who died after Charles administered what was supposed to be a routine medication. The hospital's internal investigation raised questions about Charles's competence, but rather than reporting their concerns to authorities or preventing him from working elsewhere, Warren Hospital administrators simply allowed him to resign. This pattern of hospitals quietly allowing Charles to leave rather than investigating suspicious deaths or reporting concerns to authorities would repeat itself throughout his career. Hospital administrators were more concerned with avoiding liability and negative publicity than with protecting patients. They seemed to operate under the assumption that allowing a problematic employee to quietly leave would make the problem someone else's responsibility. Charles's next position was at Hunterdon Medical Center in Flemington, New Jersey, where he worked in the intensive care unit from 1996 to 1997. During this brief tenure, several patients died unexpectedly, including Mary Natoli, a 78-year-old woman who had been recovering well from surgery when she suddenly went into cardiac arrest. An investigation into her death revealed that someone had accessed her IV line and administered an unknown substance, but hospital administrators chose not to pursue the matter aggressively. At Hunterdon, Charles's colleagues began to notice his strange behavior more clearly. Nurse supervisor Janet Wargo later testified that Charles would often volunteer to take care of the sickest patients and seemed to have an uncanny ability to predict which patients would die. He would make comments like, "I don't think Mr. So-and-so is going to make it through the night," Wargo recalled. And then, sure enough, the patient would die. At first, we thought he was just very experienced at reading the signs, but after a while, it became creepy. The pattern of Charles's behavior at Hunterdon was consistent with what forensic psychologists call hero complex, a phenomenon where healthcare workers create medical emergencies so they can be seen as heroes when they respond to them. However, Charles's version of this complex was darker and more twisted. Rather than saving patients after creating crises, he seemed to derive satisfaction from the power to end lives and from the grief and chaos that followed. In 1997, Charles was fired from Hunterdon Medical Center after a suspicious death investigation. But once again, the hospital did not report its concerns to authorities or prevent him from obtaining employment elsewhere. This failure to communicate between institutions would prove fatal for dozens of patients over the next 6 years. Charles's longest tenure at any single hospital was at Somerset Medical Center in Somerville, New Jersey, where he worked from 1998 to 2003. Somerset was a large, busy hospital with multiple intensive care units, providing Charles with access to hundreds of vulnerable patients. During his 5 years at Somerset, the hospital experienced an unusual number of unexpected deaths, particularly during shifts when Charles was working. The methodology Charles employed at Somerset was sophisticated and carefully planned. He would access the hospital's computerized medication system using his own credentials or those of other nurses, withdrawing medications like insulin, epinephrine, and various cardiac drugs. He would then administer these medications to patients through their IV lines, often in the early morning hours when fewer staff members were present. The timing was calculated. Patients who died during these hours were more likely to be attributed to natural causes or complications from their existing conditions. Pharmacology logs from Somerset Medical Center, which were later analyzed by investigators, revealed a disturbing pattern. Charles had accessed the medication room far more frequently than any other nurse, often withdrawing medications that were not prescribed for any of his assigned patients. On some nights, he would access the medication system as many as 10 times, withdrawing small amounts of various drugs. This pattern suggested that Charles was not acting impulsively, but was systematically selecting victims and planning their deaths. The victims at Somerset were diverse in age and condition, but they shared certain characteristics that made them ideal targets for Charles's crimes. Many were elderly patients with multiple health conditions, making their deaths less likely to arouse suspicion. Others were patients who were unconscious or heavily sedated, unable to resist or call for help. Some were patients who had no family members present, reducing the likelihood that someone would demand an investigation into their death. One of the most heartbreaking cases was that of Ottomar Schramm, a 78-year-old World War II veteran who had been admitted to Somerset for a routine procedure. Schramm was expected to make a full recovery and return home to his wife of 52 years. Instead, he died suddenly during the night shift on December 30th, 1998, after Charles administered a fatal dose of insulin. Schramm's death was initially attributed to complications from his surgery, but investigators later discovered that Charles had accessed the medication room 3 times during his shift and had withdrawn insulin each time. The investigation into Schramm's death revealed the sophisticated nature of Charles's operation. He had learned to time his administrations carefully, waiting until patients were alone and then injecting the fatal substances quickly and efficiently. He would often return to the medication room multiple times during a single shift, creating a pattern that suggested he was conducting a systematic campaign of murder. Another victim was Reverend Florian Gall, an 82-year-old priest who had been admitted to Somerset for treatment of a heart condition. Gall was well known in the community and had many visitors, making his death particularly shocking to the staff and the local community. Charles administered a fatal dose of digoxin to Gall on March 12, 2000, causing the priest to go into cardiac arrest. The death was initially attributed to his heart condition, but investigators later discovered that Charles had accessed Gall's medical records multiple times before his death and had withdrawn digoxin from the medication room at an unusual time. The case of Eleanor Sturcker, a 90-year-old woman who died on December 21, 2001, was particularly disturbing because it demonstrated Charles's willingness to target patients who were expected to recover fully. Sturcker had been admitted for a minor procedure and was scheduled to be discharged the following day. Instead, she died after Charles administered a fatal combination of insulin and epinephrine. Her family was devastated by the unexpected loss, and her death prompted the first serious investigation into the unusual number of deaths occurring during Charles's shifts. The investigation into the deaths at Somerset Medical Centre was led by Detective Sergeant Tim Braun of the Somerset County Prosecutor's Office. Braun had been investigating healthcare fraud when he was asked to look into the unusual death patterns at the hospital. His initial review of the data was shocking. The death rate during Charles's shifts was significantly higher than during other shifts, and many of the deaths involved patients who had been expected to recover. Braun's investigation was complicated by the hospital's reluctance to cooperate fully. Somerset Medical Centre administrators were concerned about liability and the potential impact on the hospital's reputation. They initially claimed that the deaths were within normal ranges for a hospital of their size and that any patterns were coincidental. However, Braun's statistical analysis revealed that the probability of so many deaths occurring during Charles's shifts by chance was virtually zero. The breakthrough in the investigation came when Braun discovered that Charles had been accessing the medication system at times when he was not scheduled to work. Computer logs showed that Charles had used his access credentials to enter the medication room on his days off, withdrawing various drugs for no apparent medical reason. This discovery led to increased surveillance of Charles and closer examination of his activities. The investigation revealed that Charles had been stealing medications not only for use in his murders, but also for personal use. He had been taking various psychiatric medications, including antidepressants and anti-anxiety drugs, which he would crush and dissolve in alcohol. This discovery explained some of his erratic behavior and mood swings, but it also raised questions about his fitness to work in patient care. On December 12, 2003, Charles administered a fatal dose of insulin to Jin Kyung Han, a 68-year-old patient who was recovering from surgery. Han's death was the final straw for Somerset Medical Centre administrators, who had been under increasing pressure from investigators to take action. Charles was immediately suspended and banned from the hospital premises. The investigation into Hannah's death provided the evidence needed to arrest Charles. Surveillance footage showed him entering her room at 3:15 a.m., just minutes before she went into cardiac arrest. Medication logs revealed that he had accessed the medication room and withdrawn insulin shortly before her death. Blood tests performed on Hannah's body showed lethal levels of insulin, confirming that she had been murdered. Charles was arrested on December 15, 2003, at his apartment in Bethlehem, Pennsylvania. When detectives arrived at his door, he seemed almost relieved to see them. "I've been expecting you," he told Detective Braun. During his initial interview, Charles was cooperative but evasive, admitting to being present during many of the deaths, but denying any wrongdoing. However, when confronted with the evidence against him, he gradually began to confess. The confession process was lengthy and complex, spanning several months, and involving multiple interviews with investigators, prosecutors, and forensic psychologists. Charles initially admitted to only a few killings, but as the investigation progressed and more evidence was presented, he confessed to additional murders. His final confession included admissions to killing patients at multiple hospitals over his 16-year career. Charles' motives for the killings were complex and varied. During his interviews with forensic psychologist Dr. Marcella Fierro, he claimed that he was mercy-killing patients who were suffering. However, this explanation was contradicted by the fact that many of his victims were expected to recover and were not in significant pain. Dr. Fierro concluded that Charles was motivated by a combination of factors, including a desire for power and control, a fascination with death, and a twisted sense of compassion. The investigation into Charles's crimes revealed the extent of institutional failure in the healthcare system. Hospital administrators at multiple facilities had been aware of suspicious deaths during Charles's shifts, but had failed to investigate thoroughly or report their concerns to authorities. This failure was partly due to the culture of secrecy that pervaded healthcare institutions, where administrators were more concerned with avoiding liability than with protecting patients. The legal proceedings against Charles were complex and involved multiple jurisdictions. He was initially charged with murder in New Jersey, where most of his confirmed victims had died. However, investigators also pursued charges in Pennsylvania, where he had worked at several hospitals. The prosecution was led by Somerset County Prosecutor Wayne Forrest, who assembled a team of investigators and forensic experts to build the case against Charles. The evidence against Charles was overwhelming and included computer logs showing his access to medications, surveillance footage of him entering victims' rooms, witness testimony from colleagues who had observed his suspicious behavior, and his own confessions. The prosecution also presented statistical evidence showing that the death rate during Charles's shifts was significantly higher than during other shifts, making it virtually impossible for the deaths to be coincidental. On March 2, 2006, Charles pleaded guilty to killing 13 patients and attempting to kill 2 others at Somerset Medical Center. He was sentenced to 11 consecutive life terms without the possibility of parole. As part of his plea agreement, he also admitted to killing additional patients at other hospitals, bringing his total confirmed victim count to 29. However, investigators believe the actual number of victims is much higher, possibly reaching into the hundreds. The impact of Charles's crimes extended far beyond the immediate victims and their families. The case led to significant changes in hospital policies and procedures, including enhanced monitoring of medication access, improved background checks for healthcare workers, and mandatory reporting of suspicious deaths. The case also highlighted the need for better communication between healthcare institutions and the importance of thoroughly investigating unusual death patterns. The families of Charles's victims struggled with the devastating loss of their loved ones and the knowledge that their deaths were preventable. many filed lawsuits against the hospitals where Charles worked, alleging that the institutions had been negligent in their hiring and supervision practices. Several hospitals reached settlements with victims' families, though the exact amounts were often kept confidential. The case of Charles Cullen remains one of the most disturbing examples of institutional failure in American healthcare. His ability to kill patients for 16 years without being detected or stopped reveals systemic problems that extend far beyond any single hospital or individual. The case serves as a reminder of the vulnerability of patients in healthcare settings and the importance of vigilance in protecting those who are most dependent on medical care. Today, Charles Cullen remains incarcerated at New Jersey State Prison in Trenton, where he is serving his multiple life sentences. He is held in protective custody due to the nature of his crimes and the danger he would face from other inmates. Prison officials report that he has been a model prisoner, spending most of his time reading and writing letters to pen pals who have become fascinated by his case. The legacy of Charles Cullen's crimes continues to influence healthcare policy and practice. His case is studied in nursing schools and hospitals as an example of how institutional failures can enable predatory behavior. The case has also contributed to the development of new technologies and procedures designed to prevent similar crimes, including enhanced monitoring systems and improved background check procedures. The story of Charles Cullen is ultimately a tragedy of institutional failure and human evil. His crimes were enabled by a healthcare system that prioritized reputation and liability over patient safety, and by administrators who chose to ignore warning signs rather than confront uncomfortable truths. The victims of his crimes were vulnerable patients who trusted their caregivers and who deserved protection, not exploitation. The case serves as a stark reminder that evil can exist in any setting, even in places dedicated to healing and helping others. It demonstrates the importance of vigilance, accountability, and the willingness to speak up when something seems wrong. Most importantly, it honors the memory of Charles Cullen's victims by ensuring that their deaths were not in vain, and that lessons learned from this tragedy will help protect future patients from similar harm. In full, May 2023. The New Jersey Supreme Court declined to hear Cullen's final direct appeal, leaving his 17 life sentences intact. He is currently housed at New Jersey State Prison in Trenton. The coast-to-coast killer. The fluorescent lights of the Walmart checkout line cast harsh shadows across Tommy Lynn Sell's gaunt face as he counted out crumpled bills for a bottle of cheap whiskey on the evening of December 30th, 1999. At 35, his weathered features told the story of a man who had lived several lifetimes worth of violence, each line etched by drugs, alcohol, and an insatiable hunger for inflicting pain. The cashier, a teenager with bright eyes and a future ahead of her, handed him his change with a polite smile. She had no way of knowing she was looking into the eyes of one of America's most prolific serial killers, a man who had spent the last 14 years carving a bloody path across the continental United States, leaving behind a trail of bodies that investigators would later estimate at over 70 victims. Less than 24 hours later, Tommy Lynn Sells would commit the crime that would finally end his reign of terror, but not before adding 2 more names to his already staggering victim count. The story of how he got to that moment, standing in a suburban Texas Walmart, just hours away from his final act of violence, begins decades earlier in the hardscrabble town of Holcomb, Missouri, where a troubled boy named Tommy Lynn Sells first learned that the world was a place where the strong preyed upon the weak. Born on June 28, 1964, Tommy Lynn Sells entered the world already marked by misfortune. His mother, Nina Sells, was an alcoholic who struggled to care for her children, while his father remained largely absent from his life. The Sells household was a revolving door of violence, neglect, and sexual abuse that would shape Tommy's twisted worldview from his earliest memories. By the age of 7, Tommy had already been sexually molested by a male relative, an experience that planted the first seeds of the rage that would eventually consume him entirely. The abuse continued throughout his childhood, creating a perfect storm of psychological damage that mental health experts would later identify as the breeding ground for his eventual transformation into a predator. Unlike the Hollywood stereotypes of serial killers as criminal masterminds, Tommy Lynn Sells was a product of systematic brutalization, a damaged child who grew into a damaged man with an insatiable need to inflict upon others the pain that had been inflicted upon him. At the age of 13, Tommy ran away from home for the first time, beginning what would become a pattern of transient living that would define the rest of his life. He survived on the streets through petty theft, odd jobs, and increasingly violent encounters with other drifters and outcasts. It was during this period that he committed his first murder, though the exact details would remain buried in his own fractured memories for decades to come. The year 1985 marked the beginning of what investigators would later term Tommy Lynn Sells' active period. The span of 14 years during which he would methodically hunt, stalk, and kill victims across multiple states with a frequency that defied belief. His first confirmed victim was Suzanne Korch, a 27-year-old woman he encountered in New York. On May 13, 1985, Sells brutally murdered Korch in a crime that established the pattern he would follow for the next decade and a half. Random selection of victims, extreme violence, and immediate flight to another location, hundreds or thousands of miles away. What made Tommy Lynn Sells particularly dangerous was not just his willingness to kill, but his intelligence and adaptability. Unlike many serial killers who operate within a specific geographic region or target a particular type of victim, Sells was a true nomad who moved constantly across state lines, making it nearly impossible for law enforcement agencies to connect his crimes or establish patterns. He had an uncanny ability to blend into whatever environment he found himself in, whether it was a truck stop in Texas, a train yard in Illinois, or a migrant worker camp in California. His method of operation was deceptively simple, yet devastatingly effective. Sells would arrive in a new town or city with nothing more than the clothes on his back and whatever money he could scrape together. He would find temporary work, often manual labor that paid cash and required no background checks, and scout potential victims while appearing to be just another drifter looking for honest work. His targets were typically vulnerable individuals, women alone, elderly people, children, and other transients who wouldn't be immediately missed if they disappeared. The summer of 1987 brought one of Sells' most heinous crimes when he encountered the Dardeen family in Jefferson County, Illinois. Keith Dardeen, his pregnant wife Elaine, and their 3-year-old son Peter became victims of what investigators would later describe as one of the most brutal family annihilations in American criminal history. On November 18, 1987, Sells broke into the Dardeen home while Keith was at work. What happened next would haunt even the most experienced homicide detectives for decades to come. Elaine Dardeen, who was 7 months pregnant at the time, was tortured and beaten with such savagery that her unborn child was delivered during the attack. Both mother and baby died from their injuries, while 3-year-old Peter was beaten to death with a baseball bat. When Keith Dardeen returned home from work that evening, Sells was waiting for him. Keith's body was found the next day in a field several miles from the house, shot in the head execution style. The Dardeen murders shocked the small Illinois community and drew national media attention, but investigators had no viable suspects and few leads to follow. Sells had already moved on to his next hunting ground, leaving behind only the devastating aftermath of his violence. The case would remain unsolved for over a decade, one of many crimes that Sells committed during his years of nomadic killing. Throughout the late 1980s and early 1990s, Sells continued his cross-country murder spree with methodical precision. He killed truck stop prostitutes in Tennessee, murdered elderly couples in their homes in Texas, and stalked college students in California. His victims ranged in age from toddlers to senior citizens, spanning every demographic and social class. The only common thread was opportunity. Sells killed when the urge struck him and when he believed he could get away with it. One of the most chilling aspects of Tommy Lynn Sells's criminal career was his ability to maintain relationships and appear normal to those around him, even while actively committing murders. He married multiple times during his killing spree, often abandoning wives and children when the urge to kill became too strong to resist, or when he sensed that law enforcement might be closing in on him. His ex-wives would later describe him as charming and manipulative, capable of presenting a facade of normalcy that completely masked his true nature. In 1992, Sells committed what he would later describe as one of his most satisfying kills when he murdered Stephanie Mahaney, a 13-year-old girl he encountered in Springfield, Missouri. The murder was particularly brutal, even by Sells's standards, involving sexual assault, torture, and mutilation. Stephanie's body was discovered in a remote wooded area 3 days after she was reported missing, and the crime scene was so disturbing that several veteran investigators requested transfers rather than continue working the case. The Mahaney murder represented a turning point in Sell's evolution as a killer. Prior to this crime, his murders had been largely opportunistic. Violent outbursts triggered by drugs, alcohol, or perceived slights. The Mahaney case marked the beginning of a more deliberate and sadistic approach to his crimes, as if he had discovered that murder itself was not enough to satisfy his psychological needs. He began to prolong his victims' suffering, to savor their fear and pain in ways that suggested a complete abandonment of whatever humanity might have remained within him. As the 1990s progressed, Sell's crimes became increasingly frequent and increasingly brutal. He murdered entire families in Kentucky, killed hitchhikers in Arizona, and stalked victims in urban areas from Chicago to Los Angeles. His ability to evade capture was aided by several factors: the lack of communication between law enforcement agencies in different states, the primitive state of forensic science in the pre-DNA era, and his own careful attention to avoiding detection. Sells was meticulous about destroying evidence and rarely left witnesses alive. When he did spare someone's life, it was usually because he believed they posed no threat to him, or because killing them would have created more problems than it solved. He studied police procedures, listened to scanner traffic, and paid close attention to news reports about his crimes to gauge how close investigators might be to identifying him. The case that would ultimately lead to Sells's downfall began to take shape on the night of December 31st, 1999, in the small town of Del Rio, Texas, near the Mexican border. Terry Harris, a local man with a history of drug problems, had invited Sells to his home for a New Year's Eve party. Harris had met Sells at a local bar and, like so many others before him, had no idea of the danger he was inviting into his life. The Harris household that night included Terry's girlfriend, her 10-year-old daughter Katie Harris, and Katie's 13-year-old friend, Crystal Surlis, who was sleeping over for the holiday. The adults consumed large quantities of alcohol and cocaine throughout the evening, eventually passing out in the living room while the two girls slept in a back bedroom. Sometime after midnight, as 1999 became 2000, Tommy Lynn Sells crept through the darkened house toward the bedroom where the two girls lay sleeping. What happened next would finally bring his 14-year killing spree to an end, but not before claiming one more innocent life. Sells later told investigators that he had intended to rape both girls before killing them, describing the crime with a casual indifference that chilled even hardened detectives. He began with Katie Harris, using a knife he had taken from the kitchen to slash her throat with such force that she was nearly decapitated. The 10-year-old died almost instantly, her blood soaking the sheets and mattress where she had been peacefully sleeping just moments before. Crystal Searles awakened to find Sells standing over her with the bloody knife in his hand. In the split second before he struck, she saw his face clearly in the dim light filtering through the bedroom window, a detail that would prove crucial to his eventual capture. Sells slashed Crystal's throat with the same vicious motion he had used on Katie, but his aim was slightly off. The blade cut deeply into her neck, but missed the major arteries that would have caused her to bleed to death within minutes. Believing that both girls were dead, Sells fled the house and disappeared into the night. But Crystal Searles was still alive, though barely. Despite her severe injuries and massive blood loss, the 13-year-old managed to crawl from the bedroom, through the house, and outside to a neighbor's home where she collapsed on the front porch. The neighbors called 911, and Crystal was rushed to Val Verde Regional Medical Center in Del Rio, where trauma surgeons worked frantically to save her life. The fact that Crystal Searles survived Tommy Lynn Sells' attack was nothing short of miraculous. The knife wound to her throat had come within millimeters of severing her carotid artery, and she had lost nearly half of her blood by the time she reached the hospital. But survive she did, and her survival would prove to be the key to finally bringing one of America's most prolific serial killers to justice. Detective Paul Chavez of the Del Rio Police Department was assigned to investigate the Harris murder, and he immediately recognized that this was no ordinary crime. The level of violence, the apparent randomness of the attack, and the fact that the perpetrator had attempted to kill both girls suggested the work of someone with extensive experience in committing murder. When Crystal Searles was able to speak, 3 days after the attack, she provided Chavez with a detailed description of her attacker that would prove remarkably accurate. Working with a police sketch artist, Crystal described a tall, thin white man with unkempt brown hair and distinctive facial features. The sketch was distributed to law enforcement agencies throughout Texas and neighboring states, and within days, tips began pouring in from people who recognized the face. Several callers identified the man in the sketch as someone they had seen in the Del Rio area in the days leading up to the murder, often in the company of Terry Harris. The breakthrough in the case came when Detective Chavez received a call from the Pecos County Sheriff's Office, located about 100 miles north of Del Rio. Deputies there had arrested a man matching the description in the sketch on unrelated charges and were holding him in the county jail. The man had given his name as Tommy Lynn Sells, and a quick background check revealed an extensive criminal history dating back to his teenage years. On January 2, 2000, Detective Chavez drove to the Pecos County Jail to interview Sells about the Harris murder. What he found was a man who seemed almost relieved to finally be caught. After years of running from one crime to another, constantly looking over his shoulder and living in fear of capture, Sells appeared ready to unburden himself of the secrets he had been carrying. The interview began with Chavez asking routine questions about Sells' whereabouts on New Year's Eve. Initially, Sells denied any involvement in the Harris murder, claiming he had been elsewhere at the time. But as the questioning continued, his story began to fall apart. Chavez had done his homework, gathering evidence that placed Sells in Del Rio on the night of the murder and documenting his connection to Terry Harris. Faced with mounting evidence and the possibility of the death penalty, Sells' resistance began to crumble. In a moment that would later be described as one of the most significant confessions in American criminal history, Tommy Lynn Sells looked across the interview table at Detective Chavez and said, "I killed the little girl." But that confession was only the beginning. Over the course of the next several hours, Sells began to describe crime after crime, murder after murder, spanning a 14-year period and covering thousands of miles across the United States. He spoke with disturbing casualness about killings in Texas, Illinois, Missouri, Tennessee, Kentucky, California, and numerous other states. He described victims by name, provided details about crime scenes that had never been released to the public, and drew maps showing where bodies had been disposed of. Detective Chavez quickly realized that he was dealing with something far beyond a single murder case. The man sitting across from him was potentially one of the most prolific serial killers in American history, responsible for dozens of unsolved murders that had baffled investigators for years. Chavez immediately contacted the FBI's Behavioral Analysis Unit and requested assistance in documenting and verifying Cell's confessions. What followed was one of the most extensive serial killer investigations in FBI history. Teams of agents and detectives from multiple states converged on Texas to interview Cell's and attempt to verify his claims. The process was complicated by Cell's transient lifestyle and his tendency to embellish or fabricate details. But gradually, a clear picture began to emerge of a killing spree that dwarfed even the most notorious serial murder cases. Forensic evidence began to support many of Cell's confessions. DNA samples collected from old crime scenes matched his genetic profile, and physical evidence that had been stored for years suddenly took on new significance. Cold cases that had frustrated investigators for decades were finally being solved, bringing long-awaited closure to families who had spent years wondering what had happened to their loved ones. The legal proceedings against Tommy Lynn Sells moved forward with deliberate speed. He was initially charged with the capital murder of Katie Harris, and prosecutors made it clear that they would seek the death penalty. Sells' defense team, led by appointed attorneys who faced an almost impossible task, attempted to argue that their client's troubled childhood and history of abuse constituted mitigating factors that should spare him from execution. The trial began in September 2000 in Del Rio, Texas, with intense media coverage and a packed courtroom. Prosecutor Fred Hernandez methodically presented evidence linking Sells to the Harris murder, including DNA evidence, witness testimony, and Sells' own detailed confession. The prosecution's star witness was Crystal Searles herself, who had recovered sufficiently from her injuries to testify about the night that changed her life forever. Crystal's testimony was devastating to the defense. Despite being only 13 years old, she displayed remarkable composure as she described waking up to find Tommy Lynn Sells standing over her with a bloody knife. She identified him in court as her attacker, pointing directly at him and stating firmly, "That's the man who tried to kill me." The defense team's strategy centered on portraying Sells as a product of severe childhood abuse who suffered from multiple mental illnesses that impaired his ability to control his actions. They presented testimony from psychologists and social workers who described the horrific conditions of Sells' upbringing and argued that he had been failed by every system that should have protected him as a child. But the prosecution countered with evidence of Sells' calculating behavior and his ability to plan and execute complex crimes over many years. They argued that whatever trauma he had suffered as a child did not excuse the suffering he had inflicted on dozens of innocent victims, including children who were even younger than he had been when his own abuse began. The jury deliberated for less than 3 hours before returning a guilty verdict on all charges. The penalty phase of the trial was equally swift, with the same jury recommending death after hearing additional evidence about Sells' other murders. On October 18, 2000, Judge William Buck Cook formally sentenced Tommy Lynn Sells to death by lethal injection. Following his conviction, Sells continued to confess to additional murders, eventually claiming responsibility for over 70 killings across multiple states. Some of these confessions were verified through forensic evidence and investigative work, while others remained unsubstantiated. The true number of his victims may never be known with certainty, as many of his crimes involved transients and other marginalized individuals whose disappearances might not have been immediately reported or thoroughly investigated. Tommy Lynn Sells spent the next 14 years on death row at the Polunsky Unit near Huntsville, Texas. During this time, he granted numerous interviews to journalists, authors, and criminologists who were studying his case. He seemed to relish the attention and often provided graphic details about his crimes with an enthusiasm that disturbed even experienced investigators. In these interviews, Sells displayed no genuine remorse for his actions, instead focusing on his own suffering and the injustices he felt he had endured throughout his life. He maintained that his troubled childhood and history of abuse justified his actions, arguing that society had created the monster he became. This self-serving narrative ignored the fact that millions of people suffer childhood trauma without becoming serial killers, and that many of his victims had endured hardships equal to or greater than his own. On April 3, 2014, Tommy Lynn Sells was executed by lethal injection at the Huntsville unit of the Texas State Penitentiary. His final statement was brief and unrepentant. "I would like to say goodbye to my family. Love you all. That's it." He was pronounced dead at 6:27 p.m., bringing to an end one of the most extensive killing sprees in American criminal history. The case of Tommy Lynn Sells raises profound questions about the nature of evil and the factors that create serial killers. His crimes span a 14-year period during which he moved freely across the United States, exploiting weaknesses in law enforcement communication and the vulnerability of society's most marginalized members. His victims included children, elderly people, families, and fellow drifters, individuals whose only misfortune was crossing paths with a man who had surrendered entirely to his darkest impulses. The investigation into Sells' crimes also highlighted significant problems in how missing persons cases were handled, particularly when the victims came from transient or economically disadvantaged backgrounds. Many of his murders might have been prevented if law enforcement agencies had been better equipped to track patterns across state lines and if more attention had been paid to the disappearances of people who existed on society's margins. Perhaps most significantly, the Tommy Lynn Sells case demonstrated the crucial importance of survivor testimony in bringing serial killers to justice. Crystal Searles' survival and her courage in testifying against her attacker were instrumental in ending Sells' killing spree and providing closure for the families of his many victims. Her recovery from her physical and emotional trauma stands as a testament to human resilience in the face of unimaginable horror. Today, Crystal Searles lives under a different name, having built a new life far from the scene of that terrible New Year's Eve in Del Rio. The scar on her throat serves as a permanent reminder of her encounter with evil, but she has refused to let that night define her existence. Her survival ensured that Tommy Lynn Sells would never kill again, making her not just a victim, but ultimately a hero whose courage saved countless lives. The legacy of Tommy Lynn Sells' crimes continues to influence law enforcement practices and criminal justice policies. His case contributed to improvements in interagency communication, the development of national databases for tracking violent criminals, and enhanced protocols for investigating crimes involving transient populations. While these changes came too late to save his many victims, they may help prevent future serial killers from operating with the same impunity that Sells enjoyed for 14 years. In the end, Tommy Lynn Sells represents one of the darkest chapters in American criminal history, a reminder that evil can take human form and that vigilance is the eternal price of safety. His victims, ranging from 3-year-old Peter Dardeen to elderly couples who welcomed a stranger into their homes, deserve to be remembered not as statistics in a criminal case, but as individuals whose lives were cut short by a man who chose violence over humanity at every turn. Their memory serves as both a warning and a call to action, reminding us that the price of justice is constant vigilance and the protection of those who cannot protect themselves. The House of Horrors, Anthony Sowell's Cleveland killing ground. The smell should have been the first warning. In the autumn of 2009, neighbors on Imperial Avenue in Cleveland's Mount Pleasant neighborhood had grown accustomed to the putrid odor that seemed to emanate from the crumbling 2-story house at 12,205. They blamed it on the nearby sausage factory, Ray's Sausage Company, whose industrial smokestacks punctuated the skyline of this forgotten corner of the city. The acrid stench of processed meat had become as much a part of the neighborhood's identity as the boarded-up windows, the overgrown lots, and the general sense of abandonment that clung to these streets like morning fog off Lake Erie. What they didn't know was that the smell wasn't coming from the factory at all. It was coming from something far more sinister: the decomposing remains of 11 women whose lives had been systematically stolen by a predator who had learned to hunt in the shadows of society's indifference. Anthony Edward Sowell had been hiding in plain sight for years, a registered sex offender whose very existence seemed to blend seamlessly into the urban decay around him. Born on August 19, 1959, in East Cleveland, Sowell had emerged from a childhood marked by violence, neglect, and the kind of trauma that either breaks a person completely or transforms them into something monstrous. In his case, it would prove to be the latter. The third of 7 children born to Claudia Garrison, Sowell's early years were defined by instability and abuse. His mother struggled with mental illness and addiction, cycling through relationships with men who brought their own demons into the household. By the time he was 7, Sowell had witnessed domestic violence so severe that it would later be documented in court records as extreme and persistent. His stepfather, Thomas Sowell, was a man whose rage knew no boundaries, and young Anthony bore the brunt of beatings that left him hospitalized on multiple occasions. But it was the sexual abuse that would prove most formative. Beginning when he was just 8 years old, Sowell was repeatedly molested by a family member, violations that court-appointed psychiatrists would later identify as the catalyst for his own predatory behavior. The abuse continued for years, creating in Sowell a twisted understanding of power, control, and the vulnerability of others. By adolescence, he had begun to exhibit the warning signs that criminal psychologists now recognize as precursors to serial violence: cruelty to animals, persistent bedwetting, and an increasing fascination with fire. Yet somehow, Sowell managed to function well enough to graduate from Shaw High School in 1978 and even enlist in the United States Marine Corps. For 15 years, he served his country, including a deployment to Camp Lejeune in North Carolina and various overseas assignments. His military record would later reveal a pattern of disciplinary problems, fights with fellow Marines, insubordination, and what his commanding officers described as an inability to form normal social bonds. But he served honorably enough to receive an honorable discharge in 1985, and for a brief moment, it seemed as though military structure might have provided the framework he needed to lead a productive life. That illusion shattered quickly. Within months of his discharge, Sowell had moved back to Cleveland, where he found work at various factories and warehouses. But steady employment couldn't mask the darkness that was growing inside him. In 1989, he was arrested for the rape of a 21-year-old woman whom he had lured to his apartment under the pretense of offering her crack cocaine. The assault was brutal and prolonged, lasting several hours, and when police finally arrested Sowell, they found evidence of extreme violence: rope marks on the victim's wrists, bruises covering her body, and what prosecutors would later describe as clear signs of sadistic sexual assault. Sowell was convicted and sentenced to 15 years in prison. He would serve 11 of those years at the Mansfield Correctional Institution, where prison records show he was a model inmate, quiet, compliant, and seemingly reformed. He participated in anger management classes, attended religious services, and even earned his GED. To the parole board that reviewed his case in 2005, Anthony Sowell appeared to be exactly what the system hoped to produce: a rehabilitated offender ready to reintegrate into society. They couldn't have been more wrong. Upon his release on June 4, 2005, Sowell was classified as a Tier 3 sex offender, the most serious classification, and required to register his address with local authorities every 90 days. He moved into the house on Imperial Avenue, a property he had inherited from his stepmother, and for a brief period, neighbors barely noticed him. He was quiet, kept to himself, and seemed to be trying to rebuild his life. He even began a relationship with Laurie Frazier, a woman who lived nearby and who would later testify that Soul could be charming and attentive when he wanted to be. But beneath the facade of normalcy, something far more sinister was taking root. The house on Imperial Avenue, with its multiple floors, numerous rooms, and relative isolation, provided Soul with the perfect hunting ground. The neighborhood itself, plagued by drug activity, prostitution, and a general mistrust of law enforcement, offered him a steady supply of vulnerable victims. Women struggling with addiction, women working as prostitutes, women who had become invisible to the broader community, became his preferred targets. The first known victim was Crystal Dozier, a 35-year-old mother of 5 who had been battling crack addiction for years. On May 15, 2007, Dozier told her family she was going out to get drugs and would be back soon. She never returned. Her disappearance was reported to police, but in a neighborhood where people frequently vanished for days or weeks at a time, either in jail, in treatment, or simply hiding from creditors or abusive partners. Her absence didn't trigger the kind of intensive investigation it might have elsewhere. Dozier's body would eventually be found in Soul's backyard, buried in a shallow grave beneath a makeshift garden. Forensic evidence would later reveal that she had been strangled, likely with a rope or cord, and that her body showed signs of sexual assault both before and after death. But in 2007, all her family knew was that Crystal had disappeared, joining the ranks of missing women whose cases filled filing cabinets at Cleveland Police Headquarters, but rarely made headlines. Over the next 2 years, the pattern would repeat itself with horrifying regularity. Tishana Culver, 31, vanished in June 2008 after telling friends she was meeting someone who could help her get drugs. Leshanda Long, 25, disappeared in August 2008, leaving behind 2 young children and a family that would spend months searching for her. Amelda Hunter, 47, was last seen in April 2009, walking down Kinsman Road toward the Mount Pleasant neighborhood. Each disappearance followed a similar script. The victims were African American women, most struggling with drug addiction, many involved in prostitution, all marginalized by a society that had largely written them off. They were women whose absence might be noted by family and friends, but rarely generated sustained media attention or intensive police investigations. In the language of criminal psychology, they were less dead. Victims whose murders are less likely to be solved, less likely to generate public outrage, and more likely to be dismissed as the inevitable consequence of their lifestyle choices. This societal indifference provided Soul with the perfect cover. He could lure women to his house with promises of drugs or money, assault and murder them, and dispose of their bodies without fear of immediate discovery. The smell that increasingly permeated the neighborhood was explained away as industrial waste. The occasional scream or argument that neighbors heard was dismissed as domestic disputes or drug-related violence, all too common in an area that had seen its share of both. But Soul was making mistakes, leaving evidence that would eventually unravel his carefully constructed facade. On September 22, 2008, he attacked a woman named Gladys Wade in his house, beating and raping her before she managed to escape. Wade immediately reported the assault to police, providing them with a detailed description of her attacker and the house where the crime had occurred. But when officers arrived at 12,205 Imperial Avenue to investigate, Soul wasn't home, and they filed the case as unfounded, a decision that would later be heavily criticized during congressional hearings on law enforcement's handling of violence against women. The investigation that should have begun in 2008 was delayed by more than a year, during which time Soul continued killing. Nancy Cobbs, 43, disappeared in April 2009. Janice Webb, 49, vanished in June 2009. Each murder added to the growing catalogue of evidence hidden within the house on Imperial Avenue. Evidence that included not just bodies but personal belongings, identification documents, and forensic material that would later provide investigators with a detailed timeline of Sowell's crimes. The beginning of the end came on October 29, 2009, when Cleveland police finally executed a search warrant at Sowell's house in connection with a rape case involving a different victim. What they discovered inside would shock even veteran homicide detectives who had seen decades of violent crime. The house was a charnel house, a repository of death that had been accumulating victims for more than 2 years. The first body was found in the living room, wrapped in plastic and hidden behind a false wall that Sowell had constructed. The second was discovered in the basement, buried beneath concrete and debris. The third was found in a crawl space, so badly decomposed that initial identification required dental records. As the search continued, the body count climbed. 4 bodies in the backyard, 3 more in various rooms throughout the house, and evidence of at least 2 additional victims whose remains had been partially destroyed or disposed of elsewhere. The forensic investigation that followed was one of the most complex in Cleveland's history. The Cuyahoga County Coroner's Office brought in specialists in forensic anthropology, entomology, and pathology to help identify victims and establish cause of death. The state of decomposition varied dramatically. Some bodies had been in the house for months, others for years, requiring investigators to use everything from DNA analysis to insect evidence to establish timelines. What emerged from this painstaking forensic work was a portrait of systematic predation that had gone undetected for far too long. Sowell had developed a sophisticated method for selecting, luring, and disposing of victims. He targeted women whose disappearances were unlikely to generate intensive investigations, used his military training to subdue and control them, and exploited his familiarity with the house's layout to hide evidence of his crimes. The psychological profile that emerged during his trial painted a picture of a man whose traumatic childhood had combined with inherent personality disorders to create a perfect storm of predatory behavior. Dr. James Reardon, a forensic psychiatrist who examined Sowell extensively, testified that he exhibited classic signs of antisocial personality disorder, sexual sadism disorder, and what criminologists term organized serial killing behavior. Unlike disorganized killers who act impulsively, Sowell planned his attacks, prepared disposal sites in advance, and took deliberate steps to avoid detection. But perhaps most chilling was the realization that Sowell's crimes had been enabled by systemic failures at multiple levels. The Cleveland Police Department's handling of rape reports in the Mount Pleasant neighborhood had been inadequate for years, with cases routinely classified as unfounded or given minimal investigative attention. The sex offender registry system, designed to monitor high-risk offenders like Sowell, had failed to detect his pattern of predatory behavior. And the broader community's indifference to the disappearances of marginalized women had provided him with a hunting ground where victims could vanish without consequence. The trial of Anthony Sowell began on June 6, 2011, in Cuyahoga County Common Police Court. Judge Dick Ambrose presided over proceedings that would last nearly 2 months and feature testimony from more than 100 witnesses. Prosecutor Rick Pianka presented evidence that was as comprehensive as it was horrifying. Crime scene photographs showing the condition of Sowell's house, forensic testimony about the condition of the victim's remains, and emotional statements from family members who had spent years wondering what had happened to their loved ones. The defense, led by attorney Rufus Sims, attempted to argue that Sowell's traumatic childhood and military service had contributed to psychological disorders that should mitigate his culpability. They presented evidence of his abuse, his service record, and expert testimony about the long-term effects of trauma on brain development. But the sheer scope of Sowell's crimes, 11 murders committed over more than 2 years, made it impossible to argue that he was anything other than a calculated predator who had made deliberate choices to torture and kill. The most powerful testimony came from the families of Sowell's victims. Donita Carmichael, Crystal Dozier's daughter, spoke about the years of uncertainty her family had endured, not knowing whether her mother was dead or alive. "Every day, we hoped she would walk through that door," she told the court. "Every day, we wondered if she was suffering somewhere. Now we know the truth, and it's worse than anything we imagined." Fudgy Henderson, Imelda Hunter's sister, described the impact of her sister's disappearance on their close-knit family. "Imelda was our heart," she testified. "She struggled with drugs, but she was still our sister, still a human being who deserved to live. This man took that away from us, and he took it away from her children, who will never see their mother again." The jury deliberated for less than 3 hours before returning guilty verdicts on all charges. 11 counts of aggravated murder, 4 counts of kidnapping, 2 counts of attempted murder, 4 counts of rape, and 1 count of tampering with evidence. The speed of their decision reflected not just the overwhelming evidence against Sowell, but the methodical way prosecutors had presented their case, building a narrative that was impossible to refute. During the penalty phase of the trial, the same jury that had convicted Sowell was asked to decide whether he should receive the death penalty or life in prison without the possibility of parole. The decision required them to weigh aggravating factors, the nature and circumstances of the offences, Sowell's prior conviction for rape, and the vulnerability of his victims, against mitigating factors such as his military service and history of childhood abuse. The aggravating factors proved overwhelming. On August 12, 2011, the jury recommended the death penalty, and Judge Ambrose formally sentenced Sowell to death. "The defendant's conduct was so depraved, so callous, and so cruel that it warrants the ultimate punishment," Ambrose said during sentencing. "The victims in this case were particularly vulnerable, and the defendant exploited that vulnerability in the most heinous way possible." But even as Sowell was sentenced to death, the broader questions raised by his case remained unanswered. How had a registered sex offender been able to kill 11 women over more than 2 years without detection? Why had police failed to properly investigate multiple rape reports that could have stopped him sooner? And what did his ability to prey on marginalized women say about society's commitment to protecting all citizens, regardless of their circumstances? The Cleveland Police Department commissioned an independent review of its handling of cases involving violence against women, particularly in communities of color. The review, conducted by the Police Executive Research Forum, found systematic deficiencies in how rape reports were investigated, how missing persons cases were prioritized, and how officers were trained to interact with victims from marginalized communities. The department implemented significant reforms, including specialized training for sex crimes investigators and new protocols for handling cases involving vulnerable populations. The Cuyahoga County Prosecutor's Office also established a new unit specifically focused on cases involving missing persons and unsolved homicides. The unit, partly inspired by the failures that had allowed Sowell to continue killing, was tasked with reviewing cold cases and ensuring that disappearances weren't dismissed simply because the victims came from troubled backgrounds. But perhaps the most important legacy of the Anthony Sowell case was the attention it brought to the broader phenomenon of violence against marginalized women. Criminologists have long recognized that serial killers often target victims who are unlikely to be missed, or whose disappearances are unlikely to generate intensive investigations. Prostitutes, drug addicts, runaways, and homeless women are disproportionately represented among serial killer victims precisely because their marginalized status makes them easier targets. The concept of missing white woman syndrome, the media's tendency to focus attention on cases involving young, attractive, middle-class white women while ignoring similar crimes against women of color, or women from lower socioeconomic backgrounds, was starkly illustrated by the Sowell case. His 11 victims had been disappearing for years without generating significant media coverage or public concern. It was only after their bodies were discovered that their stories were told, their lives celebrated, and their deaths mourned. Dr. Stephen Egger, a criminologist who has studied serial murder for decades, used the Sowell case as an example of how societal prejudices can enable serial killers. When certain groups of people are devalued by society, predators learn to exploit that devaluation, he explained in testimony before a congressional subcommittee examining violence against women. Anthony Sowell was able to kill 11 women because he understood that society wouldn't miss them, wouldn't look for them, and wouldn't hold him accountable for their disappearances. The house at 12,205 Imperial Avenue was demolished in December 2011, but the site remains a focal point for family members and community activists who have worked to ensure that Sowell's victims are remembered. A memorial garden was planted on the lot, with markers bearing the names of all 11 women. Each marker includes not just their names and dates of birth and death, but brief descriptions of who they were in life: mothers, daughters, sisters, women who had dreams and aspirations that were cut short by violence. Crystal Dozier's marker notes that she loved to cook and wanted to open her own restaurant. Tishana Culver's memorial mentions her dream of becoming a nurse. Lashonda Long's marker describes her love for her children and her hope of getting clean so she could be a better mother. These details, small but significant, serve as reminders that Sowell's victims were human beings with complex lives, not just statistics in a criminal case. Anthony Sowell remains on death row at the Chillicothe Correctional Institution in Ohio, where he spends 23 hours a day in solitary confinement. His appeals have been unsuccessful, and execution dates have been set and postponed multiple times as legal challenges work their way through the courts. He rarely grants interviews, and when he does speak to reporters or researchers, he maintains his innocence despite the overwhelming evidence against him. In one of the few extended interviews he gave after his conviction, Sowell told a reporter that he understood why people saw him as a monster, but insisted that his crimes were the result of mental illness rather than evil intent. "I know what I did was wrong," he said. "I know those families are hurting, but I'm not the person they think I am. I'm sick, and I need help, not death." Mental health experts who have examined Sowell's case note that his claims of mental illness, while possibly containing elements of truth, don't diminish his legal or moral culpability. Dr. Park Dietz, a forensic psychiatrist who has consulted on hundreds of high-profile criminal cases, explained that many serial killers have personality disorders or histories of trauma, but that doesn't excuse their crimes or make them less responsible for their actions. Anthony Sowell made deliberate choices over a period of years, Dr. Dietz said. He chose his victims, he planned his attacks, he concealed evidence, and he continued killing even after close calls with law enforcement. These are not the actions of someone who was mentally incapacitated or unable to control his behavior. These are the actions of a predator who simply didn't care about the consequences of his actions. The investigation into Sowell's crimes officially closed in 2012, but questions remain about whether he may have committed additional murders that were never discovered. FBI behavioral analysts who profiled him noted that his methods were sophisticated and his crimes were well concealed, suggesting that he may have been killing for longer than investigators initially believed. Several unsolved disappearances in Cleveland and other cities where Sowell lived or visited remain under review, though no additional charges have been filed. The case also highlighted the challenges that law enforcement faces when investigating crimes against marginalized populations. The women Sowell targeted lived in a world that was largely invisible to mainstream society, a world of addiction, poverty, and survival sex work that exists on the margins of even the most disadvantaged communities. Understanding this world gaining the trust of potential witnesses, and conducting effective investigations requires specialized training and cultural competency that many police departments lack. Detective Mel Smith, who led the investigation into Seoul's crimes, reflected on these challenges in his retirement interview. "We knew these women existed," he said. "We saw them on the streets. We responded to calls involving them. We arrested them for drugs or prostitution. But we didn't really see them as people with families who loved them and who would miss them when they were gone. That was our failure, and it cost lives." The legacy of Anthony Soul's crimes extends beyond the immediate tragedy of 11 murdered women. His case has become a touchstone for discussions about violence against women, racial bias in law enforcement, and the vulnerability of marginalized populations to predatory violence. It has inspired policy changes, training programs, and advocacy efforts aimed at ensuring that all victims of crime receive equal attention and protection regardless of their background or circumstances. In Cleveland, the Mount Pleasant neighborhood where Soul's house once stood has undergone significant changes in the years since his arrest. Community organizations have worked to address the underlying social problems that made the area vulnerable to predatory behavior. New businesses have opened, vacant lots have been converted to community gardens, and resident-led safety initiatives have created networks of mutual support and protection. But the scars remain visible. Family members of Soul's victims continue to struggle with grief, trauma, and unanswered questions about how their loved ones' deaths could have been prevented. Some have become advocates for victims' rights and criminal justice reform. Others have retreated from public attention, focusing on healing and rebuilding their lives away from the spotlight. The story of Anthony Soul is ultimately a story about the consequences of societal indifference, about what happens when certain groups of people are deemed expendable by the communities around them. It's a reminder that behind every criminal statistic is a human being whose life had value, whose death deserves justice, and whose memory deserves to be honored. As legal appeals continue and Soul awaits his fate on death row, the women he killed remain more than just victims in a true crime narrative. They are mothers, daughters, sisters, and friends whose absence continues to be felt by those who loved them. Their stories, finally told in full, serve as both a memorial to their lives and a warning about the dangers of turning away from society's most vulnerable members. The House of Horrors on Imperial Avenue is gone, replaced by a memorial garden where flowers bloom each spring. But the lessons of what happened there, about predation and vulnerability, about justice and indifference, about the value of every human life, remain as relevant today as they were on that autumn day in 2009, when investigators first discovered the true source of the smell that had plagued a neighborhood for far too long. Before an execution date could be set, Soul was transferred to the Franklin Medical Center for a terminal illness, and Yim died on February 8, 2021, at the age of 61. The Molalla Forest Killer. The morning fog hung low over the Molalla River on August 7, 1987, when a pair of teenage hikers stumbled upon what would become one of Oregon's most disturbing crime scenes. Nestled among the towering Douglas firs, approximately 30 miles southeast of Portland, lay the decomposing remains of a young woman. What distinguished this discovery from countless other tragic finds in America's wilderness wasn't just the remote location or the victim's obvious youth. It was the deliberate, methodical mutilation that had been inflicted upon her feet. The teenagers, their voices trembling as they spoke to Clackamas County Sheriff's deputies, described finding the body partially concealed beneath fallen branches and forest debris. Detective Rick Buckner, a 20-year veteran of homicide investigations, had seen his share of brutal crime scenes. But as he knelt beside the remains that August morning, something about the calculated nature of the injuries sent an uncommon chill through his experienced frame. The victim's feet had been systematically cut, sliced, and mutilated with what appeared to be multiple sharp instruments. This wasn't the work of an animal or the random violence of a robbery gone wrong. This was something far more sinister and deeply personal. What Detective Buckner couldn't have known as he carefully documented that first crime scene was that he was looking at the signature work of Dayton Leroy Rogers, a man whose 4-year reign of terror would ultimately claim at least 8 lives and leave an indelible mark on the Pacific Northwest's collective psyche. The discovery in the Molalla forest represented not the beginning of Rogers' killing spree, but rather its horrific culmination, the moment when years of escalating violence and sexual sadism would finally intersect with law enforcement's growing awareness that a serial killer was hunting in their jurisdiction. Born on September 30th, 1953, in Idaho Falls, Idaho, Dayton Leroy Rogers entered the world during the height of America's post-war prosperity. Yet his childhood would be marked by the kind of dysfunction and violence that criminologists would later identify as classic precursors to serial killing behavior. His father, a laborer prone to violent outbursts and heavy drinking, created an atmosphere of constant tension and unpredictability in the Rogers household. His mother, overwhelmed by her husband's volatility and her own struggles with mental health, proved unable to provide the stability and nurturing that might have altered the trajectory of her son's psychological development. Rogers' early years were punctuated by incidents that, viewed through the lens of criminal psychology, form a disturbing pattern of emerging antisocial behavior. Neighbors in the small Idaho Falls community would later recall the boy's unusual fascination with knives and cutting instruments, his tendency toward cruelty to small animals, and his early experimentation with fire setting, 3 behaviors that would eventually become known to law enforcement as the McDonald Triad, often present in the childhood histories of violent criminals. By the time Rogers reached adolescence, his behavior had escalated beyond mere troubling indicators to more overt acts of aggression and sexual misconduct. School records from the late 1960s document multiple incidents of fighting, truancy, and inappropriate sexual behavior toward female classmates. One particularly telling incident, preserved in juvenile court records, involved Rogers cornering a 12-year-old girl in a school storage room and attempting to cut her clothing with a pocket knife while making sexually explicit threats. The girl's screams brought teachers running, but Rogers' ability to present a facade of contrition and confusion, a manipulative skill he would perfect over the coming decades, resulted in little more than a suspended sentence and mandated counseling sessions that he largely ignored. The psychological evaluation conducted as part of Rogers' juvenile case proceedings provides chilling insight into the mind of a future serial killer. Dr. Margaret Thornfield, the court-appointed psychiatrist, noted in her report dated March 15, 1969, that Rogers displayed significant antisocial tendencies combined with an unusual preoccupation with feet and footwear. Her notes describe a teenager who showed no genuine remorse for his actions, demonstrated an alarming ability to manipulate authority figures, and exhibited what she termed fetishistic fixations that may indicate deeper sexual pathology. Dr. Thornfield's recommendations for intensive therapeutic intervention and possible residential treatment were ultimately ignored due to budget constraints and Rogers' parents' reluctance to acknowledge the severity of their son's psychological problems. This failure of the juvenile justice system to adequately address Rogers' escalating behavior would have devastating consequences for his future victims, representing one of many institutional failures that would allow him to continue his violent trajectory unchecked. Following his high school graduation in 1971, an achievement made possible more by social promotion than academic success, Rogers drifted through a series of menial jobs and brief romantic relationships, each ending when his partners discovered his increasingly bizarre sexual demands and violent tendencies. His employment history during this period reads like a catalogue of workplace incidents. Fired from a gas station for harassing female customers, dismissed from a construction crew for threatening a co-worker with a utility knife, and repeatedly terminated from restaurant positions for inappropriate behavior toward waitresses and female patrons. In 1974, Rogers moved to Portland, Oregon, drawn by the city's reputation for tolerance and the anonymity offered by urban life. He found work as a mechanic in a southeast Portland garage, a position that would provide him with both the technical skills and the professional credibility that would later prove crucial to his criminal activities. More importantly, Portland's vibrant street life and active sex trade would provide Rogers with access to the vulnerable women who would become his preferred victims. The transformation of Dayton Rogers from troubled young man to active predator appears to have occurred gradually during his early years in Portland. Police records show a steady escalation in his interactions with law enforcement, beginning with minor violations, public intoxication, disorderly conduct, harassment, and progressing to more serious charges, including assault and attempted rape. A pattern emerged of Rogers targeting women he perceived as vulnerable: sex workers, runaway teenagers, women struggling with addiction, and those living on society's margins. His first confirmed attack occurred on the evening of September 12, 1983, when Rogers approached Lisa Mock, a 19-year-old sex worker, near the intersection of Sandy Boulevard and 82nd Avenue in Portland's notorious prostitution district. Mock, who had been working the streets for less than 6 months to support a heroin addiction, initially saw Rogers as just another customer. His well-maintained pickup truck and clean appearance suggested he might be one of the safer encounters in her dangerous profession. Mock's survival and subsequent testimony would later prove crucial to understanding Rogers' methodology and the evolution of his criminal behavior. According to her statement to Portland Police Detective Sarah Martinez, Rogers initially appeared nervous but harmless, offering $50 for oral sex and suggesting they drive to a more private location. It was only after they had traveled several miles into the industrial district along the Willamette River that Mock began to sense something was seriously wrong. "He started talking about my feet," Mock testified during Rogers' eventual trial, her voice barely above a whisper as she recounted the traumatic encounter. "He kept looking down at my shoes and asking me to take them off. When I said no, he got really angry, really fast. That's when I saw the knife." Rogers' attack on Mock followed what would later be identified as his signature pattern. He forced her to remove her shoes and socks, then used a hunting knife to make shallow cuts on the soles of her feet while sexually assaulting her. Mock's escape came only when Rogers, apparently believing he had inflicted sufficient damage, briefly turned his attention to arranging her discarded clothing. She managed to flee naked into the industrial complex, eventually finding refuge in a security guard station and summoning police. The responding officers, confronted with Mock's bizarre account of foot mutilation and sexual assault, initially struggled to classify the attack. Veteran Detective Martinez, however, recognized elements that suggested this might not be an isolated incident. Her investigation revealed that Rogers had been questioned in connection with 2 similar attacks over the previous 6 months, though neither victim had been willing or able to provide sufficient evidence for prosecution. Mock's cooperation with law enforcement proved exceptional among Rogers' victims, many of whom were reluctant to report attacks due to their involvement in illegal activities or their distrust of police. Her detailed description of Rogers, his vehicle, and his distinctive methodology provided investigators with their first comprehensive profile of what they were beginning to suspect might be a serial offender. Despite Mock's testimony and the physical evidence collected from the crime scene, Rogers managed to avoid conviction on the most serious charges. His defense attorney, exploiting both societal prejudices against sex workers and gaps in the forensic evidence, successfully argued that the encounter had been consensual until Mock attempted to rob Rogers, forcing him to defend himself. The jury, influenced by these arguments and Mock's admitted drug use, convicted Rogers only on lesser charges of assault and unlawful imprisonment, resulting in a sentence of 18 months in Oregon State Penitentiary. Rogers's incarceration, rather than serving as a deterrent or opportunity for rehabilitation, instead provided him with time to refine his methodology and develop more sophisticated techniques for avoiding detection. Fellow inmates would later report that Rogers spent his time obsessively studying true crime magazines, paying particular attention to articles about serial killers who had evaded capture for extended periods. He showed particular interest in the cases of Ted Bundy and Gary Ridgway, both of whom had operated in the Pacific Northwest and shared Rogers' preference for targeting vulnerable women. Upon his release in March 1985, Rogers returned to Portland with a more calculated approach to his criminal activities. He had learned from his encounter with Mock and the subsequent legal proceedings that victim selection was crucial to avoiding prosecution. His focus shifted almost exclusively to women whose disappearances were unlikely to generate significant police attention. Runaway teenagers, undocumented immigrants, women with severe addiction issues, and those estranged from their families. The systematic nature of Rogers' post-incarceration killing spree is evident in the methodical way he selected and approached his victims. Police surveillance footage from various Portland locations shows Rogers conducting what can only be described as reconnaissance, spending hours observing potential targets, learning their routines, and identifying those who appeared most isolated and vulnerable. His mechanical skills allowed him to modify his pickup truck with restraining devices hidden beneath seat cushions and in the truck bed, while his knowledge of Portland's industrial and wilderness areas provided him with numerous locations suitable for disposing of bodies. Jennifer Smith, a 22-year-old woman struggling with methamphetamine addiction, became Rogers' first confirmed murder victim on June 18, 1985. Smith had been living in a series of downtown Portland shelters and supporting her drug habit through occasional sex work and petty theft. On the evening of her disappearance, several witnesses observed her entering a pickup truck matching Rogers' vehicle description near Pioneer Courthouse Square. Her body was discovered 3 weeks later in a remote section of the Mount Hood National Forest, bearing the distinctive foot mutilations that would become Rogers' signature. The discovery of Smith's remains marked the beginning of one of the most intensive serial killer investigations in Oregon's history. Detective Martinez, now leading a multi-agency task force, recognized the similarities between Smith's injuries and those inflicted on Lisa Mock 2 years earlier. The precision and deliberate nature of the foot mutilations suggested they were dealing with a killer whose psychological pathology was centered around a specific fetish or compulsion. Dr. Robert Schlesinger, a forensic psychiatrist brought in to consult on the case, provided the task force with their first comprehensive psychological profile of the killer. Based on crime scene evidence and the nature of the mutilations, Dr. Schlesinger described a white male between the ages of 25 and 40, likely with mechanical or technical skills, who harbored deep-seated anger toward women combined with a specific sexual fetish involving feet. The profile suggested the killer was probably familiar with law enforcement procedures, given his apparent success in avoiding detection, and might have had previous encounters with the criminal justice system. The accuracy of Dr. Schlesinger's profile became apparent 6 months later, when Rogers claimed his second confirmed victim. Cynthia Devon, an 18-year-old runaway from California, had been living on Portland's streets for less than a month when she encountered Rogers on December 3, 1985. Devon's youth and recent arrival in the city made her an ideal target from Rogers' perspective. She lacked the street knowledge that might have helped her recognize danger, and her absence was unlikely to be immediately reported to authorities. Devon's murder demonstrated the evolution of Rogers' methodology and the increasing sophistication of his criminal activities. Unlike his attack on Smith, which appeared to have been somewhat spontaneous, Devon's abduction and murder showed clear signs of premeditation. Witnesses reported seeing Rogers following Devon for several days before her disappearance, apparently studying her routines and identifying the optimal time and location for abduction. The crime scene where Devon's body was discovered, in a remote area of the Tillamook State Forest, revealed new aspects of Rogers' psychological pathology. In addition to the characteristic foot mutilations, forensic evidence suggested Rogers had kept Devon alive for several days, repeatedly torturing and sexually assaulting her before finally killing her. The extended nature of this crime indicated an escalation in Rogers' behavior that deeply concerned investigators. Detective Martinez's investigation into Devon's murder produced the first significant breakthrough in the case. A gas station attendant recalled selling fuel to a man driving a pickup truck similar to Rogers' vehicle on the day of Devon's disappearance. More crucially, the attendant remembered the customer because of his unusual behavior. He had paid cash, avoided eye contact, and seemed nervous despite the routine nature of the transaction. Security footage from the gas station provided investigators with their clearest image yet of the suspected killer. The investigation gained momentum in early 1986 when Rogers' escalating confidence led to increasingly risky behavior. His third confirmed victim, Maria Santos, a 24-year-old undocumented immigrant, was abducted from a southeast Portland parking lot in broad daylight on March 15, 1986. Multiple witnesses observed the abduction, providing investigators with detailed descriptions of both Rogers and his vehicle, including a partial license plate number. Santos's disappearance marked a turning point in the investigation, as her family's desperate search efforts brought media attention to what had previously been treated as isolated incidents involving marginalized women. The involvement of Santos's family, supported by Portland's Hispanic community and immigrant rights advocates, forced law enforcement to acknowledge they were dealing with a serial killer and to dedicate additional resources to the investigation. The pressure of increased police attention seemed to affect Rogers' behavior, leading to a temporary reduction in his activities during the summer of 1986. This respite, however, proved to be merely a tactical withdrawal rather than any genuine cessation of his criminal behavior. During this period, Rogers appears to have spent considerable time scouting new hunting grounds and refining his techniques for victim disposal. Rogers' return to active killing in the fall of 1986 was marked by a new level of brutality and psychological sadism. His fourth confirmed victim, Rebecca Torres, a 19-year-old woman with a history of mental illness and drug abuse, was abducted from a downtown Portland bus stop on October 22, 1986. Torres's murder demonstrated an escalation in both the duration and intensity of Rogers' torture methods, with forensic evidence suggesting she had been held captive and systematically tortured for nearly a week before being killed. The discovery of Torres's remains in the Columbia River Gorge provided investigators with their most comprehensive crime scene yet. The remote location, accessible only by a series of logging roads, had clearly been chosen with careful consideration for avoiding detection. However, Rogers' increasing confidence had led to carelessness in evidence disposal, and forensic technicians were able to recover fibers from his truck, tool marks that could be matched to specific instruments, and other physical evidence that would later prove crucial to his prosecution. The winter of 1986 to 1987 saw Rogers operating at the peak of his criminal career, claiming at least 3 more victims in a span of 4 months. The rapid succession of murders, coupled with the increasing brutality of each attack, suggested a killer who had completely abandoned any pretense of self-control or concern for consequences. Dr. Schlesinger, observing the evolution of the crime scenes, noted that Rogers appeared to be approaching what criminologists term the implosion phase of serial killer behavior, where the compulsion to kill becomes so overwhelming that the offender begins making increasingly reckless decisions. The identification and capture of Dayton Rogers ultimately resulted from a combination of methodical police work and the killer's own escalating recklessness. On the evening of August 6, 1987, Rogers approached Stephanie Martin, a 21-year-old woman leaving her job at a Portland restaurant. Unlike his previous victims, Martin was not involved in high-risk activities and had strong family connections that would immediately notice her absence. Martin's attempted abduction occurred in a well-lit parking lot adjacent to a busy restaurant, with multiple witnesses observing Rogers' initial approach and Martin's obvious distress. When Martin screamed and attempted to flee, Rogers pursued her with a knife, abandoning his usual careful methodology in favor of open violence. The restaurant's security guard, alerted by Martin's screams, managed to intervene and detain Rogers until police arrived. The arrest of Dayton Rogers on charges of attempted kidnapping and assault provided investigators with the opportunity they had been seeking for over 4 years. A search of his residence and vehicle yielded a horrifying collection of evidence: photographs of his victims, personal items taken as trophies, detailed journals documenting his crimes, and an extensive collection of cutting instruments used in his torture sessions. Perhaps most disturbing among the recovered evidence were Rogers' handwritten journals, which provided unprecedented insight into the mind of an active serial killer. The entries, spanning several years, documented not only his crimes but also his psychological evolution from opportunistic predator to systematic killer. Rogers wrote extensively about his victims, describing their suffering in clinical detail and expressing satisfaction at what he perceived as his growing skill in inflicting pain and terror. The journals also revealed the extent of Rogers' criminal activities, indicating that his confirmed victims represented only a fraction of his actual crimes. References to practice sessions and incomplete projects suggested numerous additional attacks that had not resulted in death or had not been connected to Rogers by investigators. This revelation prompted a massive review of unsolved cases throughout the Pacific Northwest, ultimately linking Rogers to at least 8 confirmed murders and numerous additional assaults. The prosecution of Dayton Rogers for multiple counts of aggravated murder began on February 15, 1988, in Clackamas County Circuit Court. The trial, presided over by Judge William Morrison, lasted 6 weeks and featured testimony from over 40 witnesses, including surviving victims, forensic experts, and law enforcement personnel. The prosecution, led by District Attorney Patricia Horton, built their case around the overwhelming physical evidence linking Rogers to multiple crime scenes, coupled with testimony establishing his distinctive modus operandi. Rogers' defense team, headed by experienced criminal attorney Michael Patterson, faced the nearly impossible task of defending a client whose own journals provided detailed confessions to multiple murders. Their strategy focused on challenging the admissibility of evidence obtained during the search of Rogers' residence and attempting to establish that their client suffered from severe mental illness that precluded criminal responsibility for his actions. The defense's psychiatric experts, led by Dr. Amanda Foster, argued that Rogers suffered from multiple personality disorders and sexual paraphilias that rendered him incapable of controlling his behavior. Dr. Foster's testimony described Rogers as a man whose childhood trauma had created profound psychological dysfunction, manifesting in compulsive behaviors that he was powerless to resist. This argument, however, was undermined by the methodical nature of Rogers' crimes and the clear evidence of premeditation documented in his journals. The trial's most dramatic moments came during the testimony of surviving victims, particularly Lisa Mock, whose courage in facing her attacker provided jurors with first-hand accounts of Rogers' methodology and psychological state during his attacks. Mock's description of Rogers as calm, deliberate, and clearly in control of his actions contradicted the defense's portrayal of a man driven by uncontrollable compulsions. On April 8, 1988, after deliberating for less than 6 hours, the jury returned guilty verdicts on all charges against Dayton Rogers, including 8 counts of aggravated murder. The speed of the deliberation reflected both the overwhelming evidence against Rogers and the jury's revulsion at the detailed accounts of his crimes. During the penalty phase of the trial, the same jury unanimously recommended death sentences for each murder conviction, citing the exceptional cruelty of Rogers' crimes and the complete absence of mitigating factors. Judge Morrison's sentencing of Rogers on May 12, 1988, was marked by an unusual departure from typical judicial restraint. In imposing 8 death sentences, Judge Morrison described Rogers' crimes as representing a level of calculated cruelty that defies comprehension, and noted that the defendant showed not the slightest indication of remorse or recognition of the humanity of his victims. The aftermath of Rogers' conviction brought both closure and continued questions for the families of his victims and the law enforcement personnel who had pursued him. Detective Martinez, reflecting on the investigation years later, noted that the case had fundamental implications for how police departments approach crimes against marginalized populations. The initial dismissal of attacks on sex workers and addicts as occupational hazards had allowed Rogers to operate unchecked for years, claiming victims who might have survived if their reports had been taken seriously from the beginning. The Rogers case also highlighted significant gaps in interagency communication and information sharing that hampered the investigation. Evidence later revealed that Rogers had been questioned in connection with similar crimes in Washington and California, but lack of coordination between jurisdictions prevented investigators from recognizing the pattern until multiple Oregon victims had been claimed. From his cell on Oregon's death row, Rogers has remained largely uncooperative with authorities, refusing to provide information about additional victims or to participate in psychological studies that might help understand his pathology. His appeals, while ultimately unsuccessful, dragged through the courts for over 15 years, prolonging the agony for victims' families and consuming significant judicial resources. The execution of Dayton Leroy Rogers took place on March 18, 2006, at the Oregon State Penitentiary in Salem. He was pronounced dead at 12:17 a.m. following lethal injection, having offered no final statement and showing no signs of remorse for his crimes. His death brought legal closure to one of Oregon's most disturbing criminal cases, though the psychological scars left on survivors and victims' families continue to this day. The legacy of the Rogers case extends beyond its immediate impact on his victims and their families. The investigation prompted significant reforms in how law enforcement agencies coordinate serial crime investigations, leading to the development of improved databases and communication protocols. The case also contributed to changing attitudes toward crimes against sex workers and other marginalized populations, with many departments implementing policies requiring the same investigative rigor, regardless of victims' backgrounds. Dr. Schlesinger's ongoing research into the Rogers case has provided valuable insights into the development and escalation of serial killer behavior, particularly the role of specific fetishes and paraphilias in driving violent crime. His analysis of Rogers' journals and crime scene behavior has contributed to improved FBI profiling techniques and helped train a generation of investigators in recognizing the warning signs of escalating sexual violence. The Malala Forest, where Rogers disposed of several victims, has been preserved as a memorial to those who lost their lives to his violence. A small plaque, installed by victims' families and community supporters, serves as a quiet reminder of the human cost of his crimes and the importance of remembering those whose lives were cut short by one man's descent into absolute evil. In the broader context of American serial killing, Dayton Rogers represents a particularly disturbing example of how untreated childhood trauma, combined with specific psychological pathologies and societal indifference to crimes against marginalized populations, can create the conditions for sustained predatory violence. His case serves as both a cautionary tale about the consequences of ignoring warning signs and a testament to the dedication of law enforcement personnel who refuse to accept that some victims matter less than others. The story of Dayton Leroy Rogers, from troubled child to Bevo, death row inmate whose sentence was later commuted, operating in plain sight while society's most vulnerable members disappear into unmarked graves in distant forests. His crimes echo still in the lives of those who survived his attacks, and in the empty spaces left by those who didn't. A permanent scar on the landscape of the Pacific Northwest, and the collective memory of all who remember that monsters are real, and they walk among us. Originally sentenced to death in 1989, and resentenced twice after appeals, Rogers remained on Oregon's death row until December 13, 2022, when Governor Kate Brown commuted all remaining death sentences to life imprisonment without the possibility of parole. Rogers, now 71, is housed at the Oregon State Penitentiary. The Beast of Ukraine, Anatoly Onoprienko's Trail of Fire and Blood. The snow fell in thick, deliberate flakes across the Ukrainian countryside on the night of December 24, 1995, muffling the sounds of the world beneath a pristine white blanket that would soon be stained crimson. In the small village of Bratkovichi, just outside Lviv, the Zaichenko family was preparing for their Christmas Eve celebration, unaware that death was already making its way through the forest toward their isolated farmhouse. Anatoly Onoprienko, a 36-year-old drifter with cold blue eyes and hands that had already claimed dozens of lives, moved through the darkness like a predator who had finally found his perfect hunting ground. The wind howled through the bare branches of the birch trees as Onoprienko approached the modest two-story home, where warm light spilled from the windows, creating golden rectangles against the snow. Inside, Mikhail Zaichenko, a 56-year-old farmer, sat with his wife, Valentina, and their two young sons, 7-year-old Andrei and 3-year-old Sergei, sharing a simple meal before attending midnight mass. They had no way of knowing that their names would soon be etched into the annals of criminal history as victims of one of the most prolific serial killers in European history, a man whose psychological profile would later reveal a mind so fractured and methodical in its violence that forensic psychiatrists would struggle to fully comprehend the depths of his pathology. Onoprienko had been walking the roads of western Ukraine for months, carrying with him a sawed-off shotgun, an axe, and a collection of incendiary devices that had become his signature tools of destruction. But his killing spree had begun much earlier, rooted in a childhood so devastating that it would take teams of psychiatrists, armed with nearly 2,000 pages of psychiatric evaluations and court records, years to unravel the psychological mechanisms that had transformed an abandoned child into what Ukrainian authorities would eventually call the Beast and the Terminator. Born on July 25, 1959, in the small village of Lasky in the Zhytomyr region of Ukraine, then part of the Soviet Union, Anatoly Onoprienko entered a world that seemed determined to reject him from the very beginning. His mother Maria died when he was just 4 years old, leaving him and his older brother Valery in the care of their father, Pavel, a man whose capacity for emotional connection had been as barren as the Ukrainian steppes in winter. The psychiatric files later released by Ukrainian authorities would reveal that Pavel Onoprienko, overwhelmed by the prospect of raising 2 young children alone, made a decision that would echo through the decades with devastating consequences. He kept Valery at home, but sent young Anatoly to a state orphanage, effectively abandoning half of his progeny while maintaining the other half. The rejection cut deep into Anatoly's developing psyche. Dr. Oleksandr Sakovich, the chief psychiatrist who would later examine Onoprienko extensively during his trial, noted in his 47-page psychological evaluation that this early abandonment created what he termed a fundamental rupture in the subject's capacity for human attachment and empathy. The orphanage, a grim Soviet institution located in Zhytomyr, was overcrowded, understaffed, and characterized by the kind of institutional neglect that bred violence among its residents. Onoprienko would later tell investigators that he spent his childhood fighting for scraps of food, sleeping in dormitories where older children preyed upon younger ones, and developing a worldview that divided humanity into two categories: predators and prey. The young Anatoly was a bright child, according to his academic records, with an IQ that would later be measured at 117, well above average. But intelligence without emotional nurturing becomes a dangerous weapon, and Onoprienko began to exhibit disturbing behaviors that his caretakers either ignored or failed to recognize as warning signs. He was caught torturing small animals, starting fires, and engaging in petty theft. More troubling, he displayed an early fascination with violence that manifested in detailed drawings of people being killed in various ways, sketches that were dismissed by orphanage staff as the normal imaginings of a troubled child, but which would later be recognized by forensic psychologists as early indicators of what Dr. Sarkovich would classify as severe antisocial personality disorder with psychopathic traits. At 17, Onoprienko aged out of the orphanage system and was thrust into Soviet society with no family support, no emotional foundation, and a growing rage that had been festering for over a decade. He drifted through various jobs: construction worker, forestry labourer, factory employee, never staying in one place long enough to form meaningful relationships or establish roots. His psychiatric evaluation revealed that during this period, he began to develop elaborate fantasies about achieving power and recognition through violence, often spending hours planning hypothetical attacks on families and communities. The collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991 provided the perfect backdrop for Onoprienko's descent into serial murder. The economic chaos, social upheaval, and breakdown of law enforcement created an environment where a methodical killer could operate with relative impunity. Police departments were understaffed and underfunded. Communication between regional authorities was sporadic, and the general population was more concerned with survival than with reporting suspicious activities. It was during this period of national vulnerability that Onoprienko committed his first known murders. On December 30th, 1989, in the village of Bratkovichi, the same village where he would later return to kill the Zaichenko family, Onoprienko encountered a young couple, Pyotr and Tatiana Kovalenko, who were walking along a forest road after visiting friends. According to the forensic evidence presented at his trial, Onoprienko approached them under the pretense of asking for directions, then suddenly produced a knife and stabbed both victims multiple times. The brutality of the attack was shocking, even to seasoned investigators. Pyotr Kovalenko suffered 14 stab wounds to his chest and abdomen, while Tatiana was stabbed 9 times and showed defensive wounds on her hands, indicating she had fought desperately for her life. But what distinguished this crime from a typical robbery or assault was Onoprienko's behavior after the murders. Rather than fleeing immediately, he spent nearly an hour at the scene, going through the victims' belongings methodically, not to steal, but to study them. He examined their identification documents, read their personal letters, and even tasted their food. Dr. Sarkovich's analysis suggested that this behavior represented Onoprienko's attempt to consume his victims' lives, to somehow absorb their existence into his own. This psychological cannibalism would become a recurring theme throughout his killing spree. The double murder might have remained an isolated incident, but the psychological satisfaction Onoprienko derived from the killings had unleashed something far more dangerous. Over the next 6 years, he would develop and refine a methodology that combined careful surveillance, brutal efficiency, and a signature element that would eventually lead to his capture: the systematic destruction of his victims' homes through fire. Onoprienko's modus operandi evolved with each attack, becoming increasingly sophisticated and ritualistic. He would identify isolated farmhouses or small homes on the outskirts of villages, spending days or sometimes weeks observing the residents' routines. He preferred families with children, later telling psychiatrists that the presence of children made the murders more complete and meaningful. His weapon of choice was a sawed-off shotgun, which he had acquired through Ukraine's thriving black market, supplemented by axes, knives, and homemade incendiary devices. The pattern was always the same: approach the house late at night, force entry through a window or door, and systematically kill every person inside. But Onoprienko's murders were not quick or merciful. Forensic evidence from multiple crime scenes revealed that he often tortured his victims before killing them, particularly the children, whose suffering seemed to provide him with a perverse form of emotional release. After the murders, he would ransack the house, not for valuables, but for personal items, photographs, letters, clothing, which he would either keep as trophies or destroy in ritualistic ways. The final act of each crime was always the same. Onoprienko would douse the house with gasoline or other accelerants and set it ablaze, often remaining nearby to watch the flames consume the evidence of his crimes. Fire investigators would later determine that he used a sophisticated understanding of combustion patterns to ensure maximum destruction, indicating that his years of manual labor had provided him with practical knowledge that he applied to his killing methodology. On January 2nd, 1996, just days after the Zaichenko family massacre, Onoprienko struck again. The Pilat family, parents Roman and Nadezhda, along with their 17-year-old son Ruslan and 8-year-old daughter Oksana, were found dead in their burned home in the village of Fastiv. The forensic team, led by senior investigator Viktor Lunev, discovered evidence that would become crucial to understanding Onoprienko's psychological profile. The killer had arranged the bodies in specific positions before setting the fire, with the parents placed protectively over their children in a grotesque parody of familial love. The investigation that followed was hampered by the jurisdictional complexities of post-Soviet Ukraine, where regional police departments operated with limited resources and minimal coordination. Detective Lunev, a 23-year veteran of the force who had investigated hundreds of homicides, later admitted in court testimony that he had never encountered a crime scene that demonstrated such calculated brutality combined with psychological sophistication. The forensic evidence suggested that the killer possessed both the physical strength to overpower multiple victims and the emotional detachment to carry out prolonged torture before the final killings. As the body count mounted throughout 1996, a pattern began to emerge that would eventually lead investigators to focus on a single perpetrator. The Ukraine Ministry of Internal Affairs, working with forensic psychologists from Kiev's Institute of Criminology, developed a profile that described the killer as a male between 25 and 40 years old, physically strong, with above-average intelligence, and a history of institutional care or military service. The profile also suggested that the killer had extensive knowledge of rural Ukrainian communities and was likely operating from a base within the regions where the murders were occurring. Dr. Valentina Tkachenko, the forensic psychologist who led the profiling effort, noted several distinctive behavioral patterns that set these crimes apart from typical mass murders. The killer's selection of isolated family homes suggested a desire to create what she termed controlled environments, where he could exercise complete dominance over his victims. The systematic destruction of the homes through fire indicated a ritualistic element that went beyond mere evidence destruction. Most significantly, the killer's apparent comfort with prolonged violence suggested a level of psychological detachment that was consistent with severe personality disorders. The breakthrough in the case came on April 16, 1996, when Onoprienko attempted to sell a shotgun to a local farmer in the village of Yavoriv. The farmer, Stepan Kamil, had been following the news reports about the family murders and became suspicious when the stranger offered to sell him a weapon that matched the description of the murder weapon. Kamil contacted the police, providing them with a description of the man and the location where he had last seen him. Detective Lunev organized a manhunt involving over 200 officers from multiple jurisdictions, the largest police operation in western Ukraine since independence. The search focused on a 30-square-kilometre area around Yavoriv, where witnesses had reported seeing a man matching Onoprienko's description, living rough in abandoned buildings and forest shelters. The terrain was challenging. Dense forests interspersed with agricultural fields and small streams, providing numerous hiding places for someone familiar with the countryside. On April 16, 1996, exactly 6 years and 4 months after his first known murders, Anatoly Onoprienko was captured while sleeping in an abandoned barn outside the village of Malehiv. He offered no resistance when officers surrounded the building, emerging with his hands raised and a slight smile on his face that would haunt investigators for years to come. In his possession were the sawed-off shotgun, an axe, several knives, and a collection of personal items taken from his victims, photographs, jewelry, and children's toys that served as grotesque mementos of his crimes. The arrest set in motion what would become one of the most comprehensive psychological evaluations in Ukrainian criminal history. Over the next 18 months, Onoprienko was examined by teams of psychiatrists, psychologists, and criminologists who sought to understand the mind of a man who had killed 52 people across 21 separate incidents. The resulting documentation, nearly 2,000 pages of interviews, test results, and analysis, provided unprecedented insight into the psychology of a serial killer. Dr. Sakovich's evaluation revealed that Onoprienko exhibited classic symptoms of antisocial personality disorder, combined with what he termed institutional reactive attachment disorder, a condition resulting from severe childhood abandonment and institutionalization. The subject demonstrated no capacity for empathy, remorse, or emotional connection with others, viewing human beings as objects to be manipulated or destroyed based on his immediate needs or desires. Perhaps most chilling was Onoprienko's own description of his motivations, recorded during extensive interviews with court-appointed psychiatrists. He claimed that his murders were driven by a desire to correct the injustices of his childhood, specifically targeting families because they represented the stable home life he had been denied. He described feeling a sense of completion when he destroyed entire family units, as if he was somehow balancing a cosmic equation that had been disrupted by his own abandonment. The trial of Anatoly Onoprienko began on November 23, 1998, in the regional court of Zhytomyr, where he faced 52 counts of murder, 21 counts of arson, and multiple counts of robbery and weapons violations. The proceedings were conducted under extraordinary security measures, with over 100 police officers securing the courthouse and surrounding area. The defendant appeared calm and cooperative throughout the trial, occasionally smiling at family members of his victims who had packed the courtroom gallery. The prosecution, led by Chief Prosecutor Mikhail Potabenko, presented a methodical case built on forensic evidence, witness testimony, and the defendant's own confessions. The evidence was overwhelming. Ballistics tests confirmed that the shotgun found in Onoprienko's possession had been used in multiple murders. His fingerprints were found at several crime scenes, and personal items belonging to victims were discovered among his possessions. But the most damning evidence came from Onoprienko himself, who provided detailed confessions for each of his crimes, describing his methods, motivations, and emotional responses with a clinical detachment that shocked even experienced criminal investigators. He showed no remorse for his actions, instead expressing frustration that his arrest had prevented him from completing his work. The defense, led by attorney Yuri Naboka, attempted to argue that Onoprienko was mentally incompetent to stand trial, citing the extensive psychiatric evaluations that documented his severe personality disorders and traumatic childhood. However, the court-appointed psychiatrists concluded that while Onoprienko suffered from significant mental illness, he retained the capacity to understand the nature and consequences of his actions and to distinguish between right and wrong. On March 31, 1999, after deliberating for less than 3 hours, The jury returned guilty verdicts on all counts. Judge Dmitry Lipsky sentenced Onoprienko to death, a sentence that was later commuted to life imprisonment when Ukraine abolished capital punishment in 2000. The defendant showed no emotion as the verdict was read, instead asking the court reporter to ensure that his confession statements were properly preserved for historical purposes. The aftermath of the Onoprienko case had profound implications for law enforcement and mental health services throughout Ukraine. The investigation revealed significant gaps in police communication and coordination that had allowed the killer to operate across multiple jurisdictions without detection. As a result, the Ukrainian Ministry of Internal Affairs implemented new protocols for information sharing and established a national database for tracking violent crimes. More significantly, the case prompted a comprehensive review of the country's child welfare system, particularly the treatment of orphaned and abandoned children. Social workers and psychologists pointed to Onoprienko's case as evidence of the long-term consequences of institutional neglect and the importance of early intervention for at-risk children. The detailed psychiatric files released after his conviction became required reading for criminology students and mental health professionals throughout Eastern Europe. Onoprienko remained imprisoned at the Zhytomyr Correctional Facility until his death from heart failure on August 27, 2013, at the age of 54. Even in prison, he continued to provide interviews to researchers and journalists, maintaining his calm demeanor and clinical analysis of his crimes until the end. His cell was found to contain thousands of pages of handwritten notes, including detailed plans for additional murders that he claimed he would have committed if he had not been captured. The case files, released in full after his death, revealed the extent to which childhood abandonment and institutional neglect had shaped one of history's most prolific serial killers. Dr. Sakovich's final evaluation concluded that Onoprienko represented a perfect storm of genetic predisposition, environmental trauma, and societal breakdown that had created a killing machine capable of unprecedented violence. The small villages of western Ukraine where Onoprienko committed his crimes have never fully recovered from the trauma he inflicted. Memorial services are still held annually for his victims, and many of the crime scenes remain abandoned, their burned foundations serving as stark reminders of the evil that once walked among them. The case continues to be studied by criminal psychologists and law enforcement professionals worldwide, serving as a sobering reminder of the human capacity for both abandonment and destruction. In the end, Anatoly Onoprienko's legacy is measured not just in the 52 lives he took, but in the questions his case raised about society's responsibility to its most vulnerable members and the long-term consequences of institutional failure. His psychiatric files, those 2,000 pages of clinical observation and analysis, stand as a testament to the complexity of human evil and the importance of understanding the factors that can transform an abandoned child into a monster who burns entire families in their sleep. The Horseman of Death. The morning mist clung to the weathered wooden fence posts like ghostly fingers as 11-year-old Dmitry Tashkin walked the familiar path toward the Bitsa Equestrian Club on the outskirts of Moscow. It was August 12, 1986, and the Soviet summer was reaching its sweltering peak, the kind of oppressive heat that made even the hardiest Muscovites seek refuge in the shade. The boy's mother had sent him to the stables early that morning with strict instructions to muck out the stalls before the day grew too hot. She couldn't have known she was sending her son into the hands of a monster who had been watching, waiting, and planning with the patience of a predator who understood that the perfect moment always comes to those willing to wait. Sergei Alexandrovich Golovkin had already been working at the Bitsa Equestrian Club for 2 years by that summer morning, establishing himself as a reliable, if unremarkable, stable hand. To the parents who dropped their children off for riding lessons, to the club's management, and to the local community. The 25-year-old man appeared to be nothing more than someone who had found his calling among the horses. He was quiet, methodical in his work, and demonstrated an almost supernatural ability to calm even the most spirited animals. What none of them realized was that Golovkin's apparent affinity for working with vulnerable creatures extended far beyond the equine variety. Born on November 7th, 1959, in Moscow during the height of the Soviet Union's post-Stalin recovery, Sergei Golovkin entered the world on the anniversary of the October Revolution, a date that would later seem grimly prophetic given the revolutionary violence he would unleash upon Soviet society's most innocent members. His childhood, according to psychiatric evaluations conducted years later during his trial, was marked by the kind of systematic emotional neglect and psychological abuse that criminal psychologists have come to recognize as common denominators in the developmental histories of serial killers. Golovkin's father, Alexander, was a mid-level bureaucrat in the Soviet Transportation Ministry, a man whose rigid adherence to communist ideology extended into every aspect of his home life. Alexander Golovkin ruled his household with the same iron discipline he applied to his professional duties, viewing emotional expression as a bourgeois weakness and physical affection as a dangerous indulgence that might soften his son for the harsh realities of Soviet life. His mother, Valentina, worked as a seamstress in a state textile factory, spending 12-hour days bent over industrial sewing machines in poorly ventilated workshops. She returned home each evening, too exhausted, for meaningful interaction with her son, leaving young Sergei to navigate his formative years in an emotional wasteland of benign neglect and authoritarian control. The psychological architecture of what would become one of Russia's most horrific serial killers began taking shape during Golovkin's early adolescence. School records from Moscow Secondary School, number 127, paint a picture of a student who was academically competent but socially isolated, displaying an early fascination with anatomy and biology that his teachers initially encouraged as intellectual curiosity. His biology instructor, Maria Volkov, would later tell investigators that Golovkin had shown exceptional interest in dissection exercises, often staying after class to examine preserved specimens with an intensity that made her uncomfortable, though she couldn't articulate why at the time. By age 16, Golovkin had begun exhibiting the classic triad of behaviors that criminal psychologists now recognize as early warning signs of potential serial violence: animal cruelty, persistent bedwetting, and fire setting. Neighbors in his apartment building on Leninsky Prospect reported finding mutilated cats and dogs in the building's courtyard, though no one connected these discoveries to the quiet teenager who lived on the 4th floor. His parents, when confronted with evidence of their son's disturbing behavior, responded with typical Soviet-era stoicism, dismissing the incidents as youthful experimentation that would be corrected through proper ideological education and manual labor. The transition from animal victims to human prey began during Golovkin's mandatory military service in the Soviet Army, where he was stationed at a remote base in the Ural Mountains from 1978 to 1980. Military records, sealed for decades, but eventually obtained by investigators, reveal a pattern of disciplinary actions related to unauthorized experiments on military working dogs, and an incident involving the torture of a fellow conscript that was covered up by commanding officers who feared the scandal might reflect poorly on their unit's record. Upon his discharge from military service, Golovkin drifted through a series of menial jobs in Moscow's sprawling industrial sector, working briefly as a maintenance worker at a chemical plant, a night watchman at a grain warehouse, and a groundskeeper at Novodevichy Cemetery. Each position lasted only a few months before he either quit or was quietly dismissed for behavior that supervisors described as unsettling, without being able to provide specific examples of misconduct. It was during this peripatetic period that Golovkin first encountered the Bitsa Equestrian Club, a remnant of pre-revolutionary Russian aristocratic culture that had somehow survived the Soviet era by reinventing itself as a recreational facility for the children of party officials and academic elites. The club's location, on the southern outskirts of Moscow, surrounded by dense birch forests and accessible only by a single dirt road, provided the perfect hunting ground for someone whose criminal fantasies required absolute privacy and guaranteed non-interference. The club's manager, Viktor Petrov, hired Golovkin in the spring of 1984, based primarily on his demonstrated ability to handle the facility's more difficult horses. Petrov, a former cavalry officer who had served in Afghanistan, later told investigators that Golovkin possessed an almost mystical connection with the animals, able to calm even the most aggressive stallions, with what appeared to be nothing more than his presence and voice. What Petrov failed to recognize was that Golovkin's success with the horses stemmed from his intuitive understanding of fear and his ability to project an aura of controlled violence that animals instinctively recognized and submitted to. The first confirmed murder in what would become known as the Bitsa Maniac case occurred on that suffocating August morning in 1986, though investigators would later theorize that Dmitry Ptashkin may not have been Golovkin's first victim. The 11-year-old boy had arrived at the stables at approximately 6:30 a.m., carrying the lunch his mother had packed and wearing the worn leather boots that had belonged to his older brother. Security footage from a nearby bus stop, grainy and poorly maintained, would later show a small figure walking alone down the dirt road toward the equestrian club, unaware that he was being observed from the shadows of the stable's equipment shed. Golovkin's modus operandi, as reconstructed by forensic investigators and criminal psychologists, represented a methodical approach to murder that reflected both his military training and his deep-seated psychological need for complete control over his victims. He would typically approach potential targets during the early morning hours when the stable was largely deserted, using his position of authority as a club employee to gain their trust. The initial contact was always non-threatening, usually involving a request for help with some mundane task that required the victim to accompany him to the stable's most isolated section. The physical layout of the Bitsa Equestrian Club played a crucial role in Golovkin's ability to operate undetected for over 6 years. The facility consisted of several interconnected buildings arranged around a central courtyard, with the main stable housing 42 horses in individual stalls. Behind the main building, accessible through a narrow corridor that was typically locked to prevent unauthorized access, lay a series of storage rooms and equipment sheds that had been constructed in the 1920s and retained the heavy stone construction typical of pre-Soviet architecture. It was in one of these storage rooms, approximately 12 feet by 8 feet, with no windows and a single heavy wooden door, that Golovkin created what investigators would later describe as a chamber of horrors. The room contained an assortment of tools and equipment that served dual purposes as legitimate stable maintenance implements and instruments of torture. Horse restraints, veterinary implements, and leather working tools were arranged with the precision of a surgeon's operating theatre, suggesting that Golovkin had spent considerable time planning and preparing for his crimes. Dmitry Ptashkin's disappearance was initially treated as a runaway case by Moscow police, a common approach in Soviet law enforcement that reflected both bureaucratic laziness and an institutional reluctance to acknowledge that serious crimes could occur in socialist society. The boy's mother, Elena Tashkina, spent 3 days searching the city before filing a missing person report, which was processed with the perfunctory indifference typical of Soviet bureaucracy. Detective Senior Lieutenant Boris Markov, the investigating officer assigned to the case, conducted what could generously be described as a cursory investigation, interviewing family members and checking local hospitals before filing the case as subject departed jurisdiction voluntarily. The second confirmed victim, 13-year-old Pavel Yakushev, disappeared on October 3, 1986, while participating in a weekend riding lesson at the Bitsa Equestrian Club. Unlike Dmitry Tashkin, Pavel came from a well-connected family. His father was a colonel in the KGB, and his mother worked as a translator in the foreign ministry, which ensured that his disappearance received significantly more attention from law enforcement. Colonel Yakushev used his professional connections to pressure the Moscow police into conducting a more thorough investigation, leading to the first systematic search of the Equestrian Club and its surrounding forest. The search, conducted over 4 days in late October 1986, involved over 60 officers and volunteers combing through the dense birch and pine forests that surrounded the facility. They found nothing. Golovkin, demonstrating the calculating intelligence that would characterize his entire criminal career, had developed a sophisticated method for disposing of his victims' remains that took advantage of the region's unique geological features. The area around the Bitsa Equestrian Club sat atop a network of natural limestone caves and abandoned Soviet-era construction projects, including several deep wells that had been dug in the 1950s as part of an agricultural irrigation scheme that was never completed. The psychological profile of Sergei Golovkin, compiled by Dr. Alexander Bukhanovsky, one of the Soviet Union's pioneering criminal psychologists, revealed a personality structure that combines several dangerous elements: the organizational skills of a methodical planner, the emotional detachment of a sociopath, and the sexual sadism of someone who derived pleasure from the suffering of others. Dr. Bukhanovsky's analysis, based on extensive interviews conducted after Golovkin's arrest, identified childhood trauma as a contributing factor, but emphasized that millions of Soviet children experienced similar neglect without becoming serial killers. What distinguished Golovkin from other traumatized individuals was his apparent inability to develop normal emotional connections with other human beings. Psychiatric evaluations revealed that he viewed people, particularly children, as objects to be manipulated and controlled rather than as fellow human beings deserving of empathy and respect. This objectification was so complete that he showed no evidence of guilt, remorse, or even basic recognition that his actions caused genuine suffering to his victims and their families. The pattern of disappearances continued throughout 1987 and 1988, with 5 more children vanishing from the vicinity of the Bitsa Equestrian Club. Each case followed a similar pattern: young victims, typically between the ages of 9 and 14, who had been seen at or near the stables before disappearing without a trace. The Moscow police, overwhelmed by the city's rising crime rate as Soviet society began its tumultuous transition toward glasnost and perestroika, failed to recognize the pattern that connected these cases. Detective Lieutenant Colonel Mikhail Fetisov, who would eventually lead the task force that captured Golovkin, later attributed this investigative failure to a combination of bureaucratic incompetence, institutional resistance to acknowledging serial crime, and the genuine difficulty of tracking a killer who left no physical evidence at crime scenes. The Soviet legal system, designed to prosecute political crimes and property offenses, was poorly equipped to handle the complexities of serial murder investigation, lacking both the forensic technology and investigative protocols that Western police forces had developed in response to similar cases. The breakthrough in the case came not through investigative prowess, but through Golovkin's own growing confidence and carelessness. On June 15, 1989, 14-year-old Andrei Kulikov managed to escape from the storage room where Golovkin had held him for approximately 6 hours. The boy, who had been tortured but not killed, stumbled from the equestrian club in a state of severe shock and trauma, eventually collapsing on the main road where he was found by a passing motorist. Kulikov's testimony, given over several interviews conducted by specially trained investigators, provided the first detailed account of Golovkin's methods and the horrific conditions in his makeshift torture chamber. The boy described being lured into the storage room under the pretense of helping to move some heavy equipment, then being restrained with horse tack and subjected to several hours of systematic torture that included both physical and sexual abuse. His escape was made possible only by Golovkin's decision to leave the room briefly to attend to his regular stable duties, allowing the boy to work free from his restraints and flee. The investigation that followed Kulikov's escape revealed the full scope of Golovkin's crimes and the institutional failures that had allowed him to operate undetected for over 3 years. Forensic examination of the storage room uncovered trace evidence linking the space to several of the missing children, including fabric fibers, hair samples, and bloodstains that had been inadequately cleaned. More disturbing were the personal effects that Golovkin had kept as trophies. Jewelry, clothing items, and personal belongings that he had carefully catalogued and stored in a metal footlocker hidden beneath a pile of horse blankets. The arrest of Sergei Golovkin on June 18, 1989, was carried out by a joint task force of Moscow police and KGB investigators who surrounded the equestrian club at dawn and found him calmly grooming horses as if nothing had happened. His reaction to being confronted with evidence of his crimes was described by arresting officers as eerily calm, showing none of the surprise, denial, or emotional distress typically displayed by suspects facing serious criminal charges. Instead, he simply asked if he would be allowed to finish feeding the horses before being taken into custody. The confession that Golovkin provided over the course of several weeks in custody revealed the full extent of his criminal career and provided investigators with the locations of remains that had never been found. He admitted to killing 11 children between 1986 and 1989, describing each murder with a clinical detachment that horrified even experienced investigators. His accounts of the crimes included specific details about his victims' final moments that could only have been known by someone who was present, providing prosecutors with the evidence they needed to secure convictions on multiple counts of first-degree murder. The trial of Sergei Golovkin, conducted in Moscow City Court during the winter of 1991 to 1992, took place against the backdrop of the Soviet Union's final collapse and the emergence of the Russian Federation. The proceedings, which lasted for 3 months, provided the Russian public with its first detailed exposure to the reality of serial murder, a phenomenon that Soviet authorities had long denied existed in socialist society. The testimony of surviving victim Andrei Kulikov, delivered in closed session to protect the teenager's privacy, was described by court observers as some of the most harrowing evidence ever presented in a Russian criminal trial. Dr. Bukhanovsky's psychological evaluation of Golovkin, presented as expert testimony during the trial's penalty phase, offered insights into the mind of a killer who represented a new category of criminal for Russian law enforcement. Unlike the political prisoners and common criminals who typically populated Soviet courts, Golovkin displayed a form of pathology that challenged traditional understanding of criminal motivation. His crimes appeared to be driven not by ideology, greed, or passion, but by a deep-seated psychological need to inflict suffering on vulnerable victims who could not defend themselves. The verdict, delivered on February 18, 1992, found Golovkin guilty on 11 counts of first-degree murder and 1 count of attempted murder. Judge Marina Volodina, in pronouncing sentence, described the crimes as representing a level of depravity that challenged the court's ability to comprehend human evil. The death sentence she imposed was carried out on August 2, 1996, at Butyrka prison in Moscow, making Golovkin one of the last people executed in Russia before the country imposed a moratorium on capital punishment. The legacy of the Bitsa maniac case extended far beyond the courtroom, forcing Russian society to confront uncomfortable truths about violence, institutional failure, and the vulnerability of children in a rapidly changing social order. The case led to significant reforms in Russian law enforcement, including the establishment of specialized units for investigating crimes against children and the adoption of forensic techniques that had previously been dismissed as Western decadence. For the families of Golovkin's victims, the conclusion of the legal proceedings brought closure, but not peace. Elena Petashkina, whose son Dmitry was Golovkin's first confirmed victim, became an advocate for missing children, working with other parents to establish support networks and lobby for improved investigative procedures. Her efforts, combined with those of other families affected by the case, contributed to the creation of Russia's first comprehensive missing persons database and the establishment of protocols for rapid response to child disappearance cases. The Bitsa Equestrian Club, forever associated with Golovkin's crimes, closed permanently in 1994 and was eventually demolished. The site now serves as a memorial park dedicated to the victims of violence against children, featuring 11 small monuments that commemorate each of Golovkin's victims. The memorial, maintained by volunteers and funded through private donations, serves as a reminder of both the lives lost and the importance of protecting society's most vulnerable members. The story of Sergei Golovkin represents more than simply another chapter in the annals of serial murder. It serves as a case study in how institutional failures, social upheaval, and individual pathology can combine to create conditions that allow monsters to operate in plain sight. His ability to murder 11 children over the course of 6 years while working in a position of trust reflects systemic failures that extended far beyond the actions of a single disturbed individual. Perhaps most troubling was the realization that Golovkin's crimes might have been prevented if Soviet authorities had been willing to acknowledge that serial murder could occur in their socialist paradise. The ideological blindness that prevented proper investigation of the early disappearances allowed a killer to continue operating long after a pattern of connected crimes should have been recognized. The children who died after Dmitry Petashkin were, in a very real sense, victims not only of Golovkin's sadism, but of a system that valued political orthodoxy above public safety. The case also illuminated the particular vulnerability of children in a society undergoing rapid transformation. The late Soviet era was marked by social instability, economic uncertainty, and the breakdown of traditional support structures that had previously protected young people. In this environment of chaos and change, predators like Golovkin found opportunities that might not have existed in more stable times, exploiting the gaps in social oversight that emerged as old systems collapsed and new ones had not yet taken their place. Today, more than 3 decades after Dmitry Petashkin walked down that dusty road toward his death, the case of the Bitsa maniac continues to influence Russian criminal justice policy and child protection efforts. The lessons learned from investigative failures in the Golovkin case have been incorporated into training programs for law enforcement officers, while the psychological insights gained from studying his pathology have contributed to the development of offender profiling techniques now used throughout the former Soviet Union. The name Sergei Golovkin has become synonymous in Russia with a particular type of evil that combines methodical planning with complete absence of human empathy. His story serves as a cautionary tale about the importance of recognizing and responding to the warning signs of predatory behavior, while also highlighting the critical role that institutional competence plays in protecting society's most vulnerable members from those who would do them harm.